Chapter 552. The difference between a large club and a small club was still very obvious. Small clubs basically only wanted to survive, but large clubs needed to maintain a strong competitiveness in every grade. Therefore, they would pay attention to and rope in the little magisters when they were still in their first year. However, the official recruitment still had to wait until the second year. Therefore, during such a long period of time, the students who were originally booked were likely to be pulled away by other clubs. Therefore, the large clubs would basically make a move on the students they liked again after school started, and before the recruitment. If the target was the kind of outstanding student whose talent was visible to the naked eye and was destined to reach the peak, they would naturally use some methods that catered to their preferences. For example, the sports club had obviously paid attention to Deanna for a long time. The candy they used to corrupt Deanna's will was the best limited edition ultimate candy in the candy world. If one was not an extreme candy lover, one would not be able to taste the true delicacy of the candy. However, the final result was completely beyond their expectations. First website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP Deanna, who should have had zero resistance to candy, actually rejected their recruitment again with her steel-like will. Although the sports club still gave the bag of limited edition ultimate candy to Deanna in the end, they lost, completely lost. However, the sports club never gave up. Since a frontal breakthrough was fruitless, they would use a roundabout tactic. In fact, they didn't need to do any research to know that as long as they recruited Dake Dimming into the club, Deanna's line of defense would naturally be extremely easy to break through. Therefore, they launched a surprise attack on Dake at noon today. As for the literature club and the astrology club, they really came for Dake himself. After all, Dake was the top student of the second year, and he had just rejected the aristocratic history research club that they originally thought Dake would definitely join in front of everyone. If they didn't attack now, when would they attack? Especially for the astrology club, this was a good thing to kill two birds with one stone. The one with the strongest divination talent in the first year was undoubtedly Eudora, who had the eyes of stars. But in fact Luosi Flotty, an inconspicuous girl who had always been like a vassal of Dake and Deanna, had a divination talent that was not inferior to Eudora. Moreover, Luosi's divination talent was the same as Eudora's, leaning towards astrology. This was undoubtedly a huge surprise for the Astrology Society. If he could get hold of these two gifted girls, it would be possible for the astrology club to surpass the literature club and boxing club in the future. If they wanted to break through Luosi's barrier, they would have to attack Dake Dimming. Therefore, the Astrology Society was especially thirsty for Dake Dimming, the son that Eudora mentioned. However, no matter how much sincerity these people showed, Dake would never agree. After all, the Magical Animal Society was responsible for the future of the magical elves. As a parent, he had to make some sacrifices for his children. Moreover, it would be much easier to join a large society and move forward while standing on the shoulders of giants. However, it was far from the sense of accomplishment of creating a society with one's own hands. Therefore, when facing the siege of these large societies, Dake once again said firmly without any hesitation, "Let's stop here. This is my society's recruitment office." When the besiegers quietened down a little, he said again, "Of course, if you want to join my Magical Animal Society, you can come here again after 12 o'clock sharp." The people in charge of the recruitment of the Literature Club, Astrology Club, Sports Club, and other societies couldn't help but look at each other. In the end, it was Winnie Scardy from the Literature Club who spoke. "If you don't want to, then don't force it. We are not bandits." "That's true, haha." The muscular man from the sports club touched the back of his head and smiled honestly. He then decisively climbed down the stairs. Only the cold-faced senior from the astrology club still persisted. "You really don't want to reconsider? The huge resources of our astrology club will be open to you." All right, let's go." His girlfriend beside him smiled apologetically at Dake and forcefully dragged the senior away. The small stall finally regained its peace and quiet. Dake stretched out his finger and rubbed the fruit-gnawing bug's little tail. He sighed. "It's not easy for a large society." "It's not easy for us either." The fox demon glanced at him with disdain. However, with its appearance, No matter what, it looked like it was flirting. The sword-wielding guardian lion whispered. The aura of these people is very strong. Of course. Dake leaned back on the chair and raised his head, squinting his eyes at the sky. The world was moving forward, whether it was time or people. 12 o'clock sharp. The barrier at the entrance of the venue was finally removed. More students than expected poured in. The students were always there to watch a show. Even if they weren't here to join the recruitment, they would still want to see what new societies were being established. Moreover, even if they weren't here to see the societies, they could still see the people. At the front of the crowd, Deanna was holding on to Luoxi's arm. She was stuffing snacks into her mouth while looking around. Luoxi was confused. Nana, have you seen the recruitment office of the Magical Zoology Club? Deanna was excited. Don't worry, we'll find it eventually. Let's look around first. They didn't set up the stall with dark at the beginning because they wanted to experience the atmosphere and be recruited at the same time. Wouldn't it be putting the cart before the horse if they directly went to the recruitment office of the Magical Zoology Club? However, the atmosphere of the club recruitment did feel a bit like a festival. Some clubs would even perform live to attract the attention of the students. The large societies would choose their members, and the small societies would be chosen. It had always been like this. After the first wave of people was absorbed by the venue, the second wave followed. The first wave was mostly second-year students who were in a hurry. The second wave was mostly first-year students who were here to watch the show. The crowd naturally dispersed wherever Anna and Enchi went. In the first week of school, the two little princesses had already formed their own factions among the first-year students of the aristocratic house. Now they had formed two circles that were competing against each other, like two little leopards. As for the first year's Noble Academy's Diamond, he was also supported by others, forming a third force. The current situation of the first-year students was much more complicated than Dake's time. Just the aristocratic house alone had the tendency of dividing the world into three. The two little princesses looked at each other across the mountain, and Joey, who had the smallest faction, was trying to survive in the cracks. However, because Joey had Dimming behind her and had Aurora as her desk mate, she was not without resistance. She just didn't know what their parents would think if they saw that they weren't studying hard, but were forming cliques instead. On the other side, Victoria and Phoenix also met up in the corner. The two magic elves got rid of their friends and entered the venue hand in hand. Dake was still waiting patiently in the corner of the venue. Although there was no one in front of him now, he was not in a hurry. As time passed, the crowd would always reach the end, and those with potential would probably have been screened out. Dake's recruitment target was not the second-year students. He actually wanted to rope in two third-year students to fill the gap. If he could find someone with potential like Senior Angelia last year, he would be extremely lucky. However, the probability of this happening was very small, so he was now observing the new club next door. Although he was the only second-year student who had created a new club this year, there were surprisingly many third-year students who had created new clubs. Perhaps it was because they did not understand the rules of the club when they were in the second year, but they were familiar with it and had their own ideas in the third year. There were actually quite a few people like this. The students of the Shungmalian Academy were very independent. There would be many small 5-person clubs with 1 or 2 third-year students as the axis and a few second-year students as ordinary members in the future. For example, next door to Dake, there was a third-year senior sitting alone behind a table, nervously watching the second-year students gradually swarming over. Like Dake, she had also drawn a poster, but there was only one. The wooden sign only had the name of the club written on it, and it was very simple. Dake glanced at her school uniform and knew that she was a third-year student of the House of Fools. And the club she had created alone was called the Ragdoll Club. This was undoubtedly a club centered around personal interests. This third-year senior from the House of Fools probably wanted to form a club to find people with similar interests. However, thinking about it rationally, it was indeed a bit difficult. Dake's fingers gradually touched the stem of the fruit-gnawing worm. It did not mean that there were no other people in the Shungmalian Academy who liked the Ragdoll Club, but joining a club purely for this hobby and giving up the resources of a regular club was a huge price to pay. Normal people would choose to give up after weighing the pros and cons. In addition, this senior's personal charm was limited, so she probably would not be able to recruit people. Thinking of this, Dake squinted his eyes and looked more carefully. The average age of a third-year student was 14 years old. The 14-year-old girls in this world were relatively mature, but this senior from the House of Fools looked a bit young. Not only that, but she had 2 ponytails and was wearing a fancy dress that was obviously sewn by herself. On the table, there was a ragdoll bear with cotton wool on its head. She had dressed herself up as a ragdoll. Dake observed her brown hair and green pupils, and he could not help but have an idea. She likes ragdolls, and I like ragdoll cats. We're both ragdolls. Is this a coincidence of fate? Seeing that the third-year senior seemed to have noticed something, Dake immediately withdrew his gaze and focused on Meow Meow's whiskers. Meow. Meow Meow sucked on his finger. Brittany Clichens happened to see this scene, and could not help but cover her mouth and chuckle. Of course, she could not ignore the second-year student next door who was being fought over by so many big clubs. In fact, there were not many people in the Shungmalian Academy who did not know his name. However, this was the first time she found this junior to be such an interesting person. Using a magic fairy as a decoration was not something that anyone could come up with. Moreover, his idea was quite interesting. Just like how Dake was observing her, she was also observing Dake. Magical Animal Club, if one did not care about its historical significance, was without a doubt a useless club that was not inferior to her Ragdoll Club. After all, studying magical animals on paper could not improve magical engineering technology by much. There were not many magical animals in the Shungmalian Academy, so it was impossible to do in-depth research. Maybe it's because he has the same interest as me? Brittany thought and could not help but look at Meow Meow. No wonder this junior's magic guide sprite was so cute. It turned out that he had a heart that likes small animals. Wow! The sudden sound made Brittany come back to her senses. It had been half an hour since it started at 12 o'clock. Even the Magical Animal Club, which was at the end of the line, had a few people visiting, but no one stopped by her stall. She was so focused on the next door that she almost forgot that she was recruiting new members. When she quickly turned around, she realized that the teddy bear on the table had disappeared. When she looked up again, she saw that the teddy bear was in someone's hand. Seeing the petite girl whose face was covered by the teddy bear, Brittany was overjoyed and quickly asked, "Do you like dolls?" Yes. This was the answer that she had been dreaming of. Brittany suddenly felt that she might be able to break through the barrier of 0 faster than the person next door. She immediately asked, "Do you want to learn how to make dolls?" As soon as she asked this question, Brittany noticed that the girl in front of her froze. She could not help but feel a little depressed. There were girls everywhere who liked dolls, but girls who liked to make dolls were rare. This was how the world was. People who wanted to reach out for more were always the majority. However, the girl in front of her paused for a moment before saying, "It's not that I don't want to, but my handiwork is terrible. I can't even knit clothes properly." A girl who had practiced needlework before. Brittany was excited again. She felt that the first member of her club was right in front of her. She immediately said, "It's okay, I can teach you, as long as you join my doll club." However, before she could finish, the girl in front of her reluctantly put the teddy bear back on the table and said, "No, I already have a club." Then, the girl turned around and looked at the next door. Brittany stared at the girl's beautiful face and suddenly realized something. She paused. "Ha, I lost." So this girl was the customer next door. "Deanna, slow down." The girl with light blonde hair ran over from the other side and grabbed the silver-haired girl's hand. Brittany was a little stunned and noticed that the 2 girls were not looking at her stall at all. In a blink of an eye, they had already walked next door. Dake, who had waited for half an hour without any results, hurriedly gave Deanna a sweet and sour apple as if he had seen the light at the end of the tunnel. Crunch! The fruit-eating bug blinked in confusion. Deanna grabbed it and bit down. Crunch! The poor fruit-eating bug was so scared that it closed its eyes tightly. Deanna, of course, did not bite down. She asked cheerfully, "How is it? Did you get any new members?" Dake crossed his fingers and said helplessly, "No. Generally speaking, the club recruitment this time was aimed at the second-year students. However, among the second-year students, Dake was quite familiar with the students from the other 3 schools, except for the students from the House of Fools who kept a low profile. The fact that he did not directly choose members from the second-year students was enough to explain the problem. To sum it up, he could not recruit anyone he wanted. He did not want anyone he could recruit. Of course, he wanted talents like AI Ma and Sarah. Unfortunately, AI Ma had already been booked by the Literature Club, and Sarah had already decided to join the Archaeology Club. Originally, Doran could also make do with it. However, Doran became his replacement and became the second-year leader of the Aristocratic Academy. Even Eudora went to the Astrology Club. It's really too difficult. Dake brought out the 2 stools summoned by the little devil beast and asked Deanna and Luosi to sit down. He asked them briefly about their movements. Deanna immediately began to talk about the club scenes she saw along the way. Luosi listened quietly and only added a sentence from time to time. When Deanna's mouth was dry, Dake handed her a cup of kettle apple juice and a club application form. Deanna drank the apple juice in one gulp and looked at the club application form. She asked, "Do I still need to fill in the form?" Dake nodded solemnly. Yes. The procedure was justice. Then what about me? Luosi stretched out her hand to him. Here. The little devil beast flew down from the sky and grabbed an application form in its claws. Luosi took the application form, picked up a pen, and quickly filled it out. Deanna followed immediately. Not long after, Dake finally had 2 applications in his hands. 3/5. He sighed and signed his name on the application form. He was prepared to hand it over to the student union for registration. Next, he still needed 2 more pieces of the puzzle. But at this time there was no need to rush. After he carefully kept the 2 applications, he turned to Luosi and asked, "Are you still going to participate in the dual club's recruitment in the afternoon?" "Yes." Luosi nodded. "I have to work hard too." Then she added, "Uncle and Aunt will go to the dual club in the Royal City next Saturday morning to watch my competition." Dake blinked and asked with concern, "Are you confident?" Luosi couldn't help but smile. "I'm okay." Her tutor was a senior who graduated from the Shung Malian Academy. Dake obviously knew this as well. He nodded and said, "Then I'm relieved." "You just wait here for the good news." Deanna puffed out her chest. The dual club's recruitment test wasn't that difficult. As long as you showed the strength of a second year, you would pass. Deanna would accompany Luosi to the dual club to watch the competition. And Dake. Of course, he would continue to wait here for fate to meet him. Then we'll first. Luosi patted her skirt and was about to stand up and walk around for a while before reporting to the dual club. But the person who just appeared in her field of vision made her subconsciously sit down. Since she had officially joined the Magical Animal Society, she started to consider herself a member of the society. Naturally, she didn't want people she didn't like to join the society. And the person who entered her field of vision was obviously walking towards her. She didn't want to leave for a while. Deanna followed her line of sight and curled her lips. The people who were walking towards her were White Gouda and Luo Boatbroheim. White Gouda was the son of a true hero. His performance at the end of the first year was not bad. Thus, when he entered the dual club, the person in charge of a large society immediately went to recruit him. However, White and Luo Boat had already decided to join the Marine Biology Research Division when they were first year. Thus, when faced with the olive branches of many societies, he politely declined. The reason why he used quotation marks above politely declined was because he didn't completely reject them. Instead, he replied with, "I'll think about it." After a period of peace, people's mental age would often increase by a large margin. After White returned to school in the magic car, he suddenly recalled many of his experiences in the first year. At that time, everything that had happened seemed reasonable. However, when he suddenly looked back, most of it was frighteningly childish. And in the childish part, there were some things that were extremely childish and would even have a negative impact on his future. In short, he began to regret his promise to join the Marine Biology Research Division. It was a decision made out of emotion. Now that he thought about it, it was more like the result of a slap on the head. Although the seniors of the Marine Biology Research Division did provide a lot of help for him to vent his psychological pressure at that time. But when he thought about it carefully, that was the extent of the help. In the end, the Marine Biology Research Division was just a place for people to gather together for warmth. It wouldn't bring him any substantial improvement. If he wanted to rely on the society's resources to develop himself at a faster speed and achieve his original goal of catching up to Dake, he absolutely couldn't waste his energy on the Marine Biology Research Division. Now he had his mother, the bloody concubine, to guide him on the knowledge level. Although they couldn't see each other often, it was always helpful. Therefore, what he still lacked was only the material level. Joining a suitable large society was a good way to solve the problem on the material level. Of course, the premise was that he had to break his promise and withdraw from the Marine Biology Research Division. This made him hesitate. Luoboat, you were only with me at that time. You didn't officially say that you wanted to join the Marine Biology Research Division. So you should choose a good society to join. I think the sports club is very suitable for you, White said. Luoboat pondered and said, It's said that 80% of the members of the sports club are seniors of the Night Academy. It's very suitable for us. White quickly corrected him. It's suitable for you. He didn't want to sweat with those muscles all day long. Okay, then it's suitable for me, Luoboat said. But if I join the sports club, what about you? Will you still be in the Marine Biology Society? White shook his head and said with a bitter smile, I don't know. It was also at this time that he saw Dake's wooden signboard. He couldn't help but stop in his tracks. Then he enunciated each word clearly. Robert from the Society of Supernatural Beings. He suddenly grabbed Luoboat's arm and asked, Am I seeing things? What are you seeing things about? Luoboat raised his head and also saw the signboard. But his gaze was more focused on the demon fox behind the signboard. What a beautiful magical fairy. It's the Magical Animal Society, Luoboat. Okay, I know. You're hurting me. The Magical Animal Society is my father's society, White murmured. When he started moving again, he couldn't help but speed up. Not long after, he appeared in front of Dake Dimung with Luoboat. Looking at Dake in the booth, White looked inside suspiciously. Then he saw Deanna and Luosi. But they were inseparable from Dake, so it wouldn't be strange if they were here. But the question was, why was Dake sitting in the recruitment area of the Magical Animal Society? White's brain short-circuited for a moment, and he froze on the spot. Luoboat, who was a step slower, asked curiously, Dake, you created your own society? Yes, Dake raised his head and smiled. What's wrong, Luoboat? You didn't join the sports club. Luoboat scratched his head and smiled awkwardly. Why did you mention the sports club? You make it seem like I don't have brains other than muscles? I'm a magus, okay? Dake laughed and changed the topic. Then what society did you join? White should be very popular, right? Luoboat shrugged and said exaggeratedly, That's the one. Because it's so popular, I'm still considering it. Dake nodded and asked, Then what about you? Are you waiting for White to make his choice and then applying to join the same society? That might not be suitable for you. Luoboat turned his gaze and looked at Deanna and Luosi. He pursed his lips and said, But aren't they also in the same society as you? Dake knocked on the table and a confident look appeared on his face. But this is the most suitable society for them. Deanna and Luosi smiled when they heard this. Obviously, they believed this when they rejected the invitation of the sports club and the astrology club. This was his trust in Dark Diamond's ability to hold up against an entire group. Luoboat opened his mouth and wanted to refute, but in his heart, he felt that this was indeed the case. He couldn't help but look at the White Gouda beside him. White's short-circuited brain finally reconnected and said in surprise, Wait, Dake, this is the society you founded? But the Magical Animals Society isn't. Dong dong dong. The fox demon suddenly knocked on the two words restart on the signboard. White subconsciously turned her head and stared at the two words restart for a while before muttering, Why didn't I think of it? Why didn't I think of it? Ahem. Dake coughed to attract her attention and said, White, if you haven't decided which society you want to join, I personally recommend the sports club. Skip. White immediately said. Compared to those other societies, I want to join the Magical Animals Society more. How about it? Do you have any requirements? What shouldn't have come, finally came. Dake sighed in his heart. Even if his brain exploded, he wouldn't be stupid enough to recruit the hero's son into a society. But since White specifically asked, he might as well make him give up completely. Thus he grinned and said, there are requirements, but they aren't difficult. White was a bit excited. What requirements? Dake said in a gentle tone, because it's the Magical Animals Society. The members must first be loving and like small animals. White's eyes lit up and said, I definitely fit that criteria. I even had a stray dog when I was young. Dake closed his eyes and opened them again, asking, then what about now? White was startled. What now? Dake said, your stray dog, how is it now? White's expression became hesitant. At this moment, even Earbook couldn't help but ask curiously, how is it? White hesitated for a long time and finally smiled bitterly. I don't know either. When I picked up the stray dog, I was still young. Now I only have vague memories of feeding it. As for where it went after that, I don't know. Okay. Dake listened carefully and nodded. The second requirement is to have a sense of responsibility. Our society studies magical animals, not dead things. If a magical animal escapes, we have to catch it even if it takes 2 or 3 months. White asked herself and felt that she was quite responsible, so she said, of course, that's not a problem. Dake smiled and had to use his trump card. The third requirement is to have maternal love. White. When White Gouda and Earbook Broheim left in a daze, Dake finally let out a sigh of relief. But Luosi, who was behind him, couldn't help but ask, what you said, is it true? Dake laughed. What do you think? Luosi sat upright, but couldn't read his thoughts. She could only shake her head and say, I don't know. Deanna poked her arm and pointed at the first dragon egg. Of course it's true, we have to hatch the egg. Hatch the egg? Luosi was even more confused. But isn't that Dake's magic elf? Dake looked at her confused expression and finally smiled. But Deanna is right, we have to hatch the egg. Of course, hatching the egg wasn't the real reason. Dake's maternal love was one of the requirements because he wanted the Society of Magical Animals to be the headquarters of the magic elves. And as a member of the society, taking care of the magic elves would naturally become a daily routine. Even if it was put on the table, they had to have the patience to take care of newborn magical animals. Maternal love was just a more generic way of saying it. Even if maternal love was replaced with paternal love, it would still be the same. He purposely said maternal love, just to dissuade White Gouda. In short, it seemed to be working well so far. Dake looked at the time and said, it's about time. You guys walk around a bit more, then go to the battle hall early to prepare. Luosi had already planned to do this, so she nodded and stood up. Then we'll be going first. Then she and Deanna waved at Dake and left for the time being. There are still 2 more pieces to the puzzle. After the 2 of them disappeared into the crowd, Dark glanced at the next door. Intentionally or unintentionally. After confirming that there was still no one next door to answer the call, he revealed a satisfied smile. Brittany Klitschen saw his smile and was instantly annoyed. How can he be like this? She was actually very sensitive, but she wasn't good at expressing it. Therefore, she always sewed the accumulated emotions into the dolls to maintain the purity of her heart. Dake didn't choose her at first glance because of the ridiculous fate of coincidentally being next door. When he sat down, he sensed the fluctuation of the power of the mind from Brittany Klitschen's. Although the fluctuation was very faint, it was there. Ever since he successfully used the power of the mind to help the Diru beast complete its evolution, his perception of the power of the mind had increased by a level. Brittany Klitschen's might not even realize that she had a unique power of the mind. But if nothing unexpected happened, her possibility would blossom one day between the 3rd and 4th grade, and she would become another well-prepared student of the Academy of Fools. There was no reason for him not to grab hold of such a cute senior who had a great possibility and loved dolls. Dake admitted that he was a bit utilitarian. But so what? At this moment, his precious daughter and Phoenix suddenly came out from the crowd. In fact, Dake had already sensed the approach of the magic elf, and as expected, he was pleasantly surprised, making the vampire daughter feel like she was favored. He was the incarnation of bliss, after all, so it wasn't strange for the vampire daughter to stick to him like a plaster. After going around in circles for almost a week without any intimate contact, she naturally missed it. If it weren't for the fact that there were too many people around, she would have jumped on Dake's face. Dake asked Victoria and Phoenix to sit on 2 stools and smiled. How about it? Do you have any favorite club? Yes. Victoria immediately said loudly. Dake asked, which one? Victoria smiled and said, of course, the Magical Animals Club. Dake reached out his hand and slid it across her nose. He smiled and said, you're so talkative. I'm not talkative, Victoria immediately retorted. This time next year, I want to join your club too. Okay, next year it is. Dake then turned to Phoenix and asked with concern. How about you? Do you have any favorite club? I remember there's a small to medium-sized club called Gunman Legend Club. It's a club that specializes in the history of gunmen and how to use guns. Maybe it'll suit your taste? Phoenix's expression was still cold, and she didn't say much. That's it, the Magical Animals Club. Okay, the Magical Animals Club it is, Dake said dotingly. If you can join this year, I won't have to worry about it. Phoenix deliberated and said, is it because the club needs 5 people? Dake said in surprise, yes, we still need 2 more. Do you have any seniors you can recommend? Phoenix shook her head slowly. Victoria also shook her head quickly. It seemed that they couldn't count on them. Dake tapped his forehead and talked to them about other things. First, they talked about the location of the club's classroom. Although they couldn't join the club officially, the academy didn't prohibit first-year students from entering the club's classroom. Next, they talked about the video call time on Saturday night. But since Eve and Aaron were still in the academy, the video call was not valid. Then, considering that first-year students could only enter Traveler's Street on the 4th Friday afternoon after school, Dake took the initiative to ask them if they needed to buy anything. Why was it buy and not gift? Of course, it was because the academy didn't encourage students to gift each other credits. Every credit should be earned by the students themselves. Even if it was a loan, they had to pay the interest as the price. After Victoria understood what purchasing on behalf of others was, she immediately began to chatter. However, other than the book that Dark had promised to buy for her, he had crossed out everything else. And Phoenix's request was to buy a gun for him. While the 3 of them were chatting, Dake noticed that Anna and Enchi were strolling around 5 to 6 meters away. John and Joey also appeared one after another, but they ran away without looking back. He touched his chin and asked Victoria, "Am I that scary?" "No, you're not." Victoria smiled happily. When it was almost 2 o'clock, Victoria and Phoenix left one after another, and the crowd in the venue began to decrease. It wasn't that the students were tired of the club, but that the recruitment for the dual club was about to begin. The second-year students rushed over, as if they were rushing to a venue. Before they settled down, they had no choice but to rush over. And as soon as the main force of the search for the club disappeared, the entire venue fell silent. Originally, no one would care if they shouted, but now it was extremely conspicuous if they spoke loudly. But this was a good thing for Dake. There were no second-year students in his recruitment range, so it was easier to see. The third-year and higher students either didn't join the club in the first place or left midway for various reasons. In short, this group of people became the main body of recruitment after the crowd decreased. When someone came to the Magical Animal Club's recruitment area out of curiosity, Dake would ask them their name, year, college, final grades, and why they left the club. Because it was too formal, many of the upperclassmen couldn't stand being questioned by a second-year student, so they stood up and left. Dake thought that it was no wonder they left the club midway. Of course, there were also people who were good in all aspects who sat down and asked questions, but when they found out that the Magical Animal Club wasn't going to expand in their year, they left one after another. Dake's advantage over Brittany was that he was a celebrity. This made people feel that the club he created was more secure and had more potential. Joining a club like this was a bet that it could rise steadily. Then, the students who joined from the beginning would become veterans and receive a lot of resources. However, when this celebrity said that he would not expand the scale of the club, this idea was cut off. But the club recruitment itself was a two-way choice, so it couldn't be said who was better or worse. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Magical Animal Society's recruitment office finally welcomed a decent person. When she sat down at the table, Dake was still in a daze. It wasn't until she said her name that Dake suddenly remembered where he had seen her before. This third-year girl with black hair and flat bangs was the senior he met on the magic car at the end of the semester, Katrina Isaiah. Katarina was a student of the School of Magic. She had long black hair that reached her waist, and her bangs were neatly trimmed, covering the part above her eyebrows. She was very low-key and delicate. The feeling she gave off was very similar to Senior Winnie Scatty. When Dake and the others left school and returned home, there were 3 boys and 2 girls in the cubicle. There was an empty space, so this senior was accepted. Dake still remembered that the book this senior was reading was XX Anthology. And she lived in the City of Knowledge Signs. The City of Knowledge Signs was a home of sages that produced sages. Both the sages of old and the sages of winter were born in Signs. The daughter of the sages of old, Saraswati, and the descendant of the sages of winter, Winnie Scatty, also lived in Signs. What, don't you remember me? Katrina pushed back a strand of black hair that was perpendicular to her shoulder, and then she revealed a gentle smile. How could that be? Senior Isaiah. Dake stopped reminiscing and spoke. He finally remembered. When Katrina Isaiah got off the magic car, they had agreed to contact each other after returning to school. But 3 months later, Dake had long forgotten about her in Java. Now it seemed that Deanna and Luosi had never mentioned her at all. They must have completely forgotten about her. Fortunately, Dake's memory was still passable. He didn't completely forget her name. Now that she reminded him, he smoothly remembered and avoided an awkward situation. And when acquaintances met, they were naturally more relaxed than strangers. Even though this acquaintance of his had only shared a ride in the magic chariot. Dake carefully sized up Katrina Isaiah and asked, Senior, are you here to reminisce about old times or to choose a club? I'm here to reminisce about old times, and also to choose a club, Katrina said calmly. Dake curiously asked, Senior, you didn't join the literature club? Katrina shook her head and said, the literature club isn't something that anyone can join just because they want to. And for a student of the magic school like me, even if I join, I'll only be a marginal figure. There's not much point. Dake was a little surprised. How can that be? Senior, are your grades not good? Speaking of grades, Katrina smiled a little shyly. Do I look like the type who has good grades? Dake shook his head and said, no, not good. It's not very good, it's extremely good. Katrina covered her mouth and laughed. But I only ranked 13th in the magic school at the end of the 2nd grade. Is that so? Dake said. I thought that people like you who like to read wouldn't have bad grades. Average, Katrina said. She obviously didn't care about her grades. She probably didn't prepare for the final exam at all. And studying before the exam and not studying at all had 2 different effects. Dake twirled his pen and asked, even if you didn't join the literature club, Senior, didn't you join other clubs in the 2nd grade? Katrina said, of course not. I joined a small club called the Reading Club in the 2nd grade. Our Reading Club is like a miniature version of the Literature Club. Although we don't have the foundation of the Literature Club, we still have the essentials and a complete structure. If you just want to find a place to read, it's a good place. Unfortunately, the president doesn't want to lie flat anymore. Dake, huh? Katrina shrugged and said, he joined the Literature Club. Dake. Okay. Katrina smiled gently. At first, he just wanted to transfer the club to someone else, but no one wanted to take it, so he just disbanded it. You see, the few of us just want to find a quiet place to read. We don't want to take on the responsibility of managing a club. Dake smiled. If you answer like that, I'll have a bad impression of you. Katrina said, that just means that your club isn't suitable for me. However, Dake changed the topic and said, If you just want to find a place to read, there's no better place than our club. Also, the location of our classroom is unique. It can bring you supreme visual enjoyment. Supreme visual enjoyment? Katerina blinked and quickly turned to look at the spiral clock tower. Is your club's classroom on top of the spiral clock tower? She asked in surprise. No, it's our classroom. Dake pushed a club application form to Katrina. Katrina held the application form and asked doubtfully, That's it? I heard that it's not easy to join your club. Didn't we already get to know each other on the magic car? Dake smiled. If you can accept the classroom on the 10th floor of the spiral clock tower, and don't have a floral allergy, then fill out this application form. The Magical Animals Club is definitely the best place for your soul. Magical Animals Club recruitment requirement for, be Buddhist. The reason why Dake took the initiative to tell the applicants that the club had no intention of expanding was to eliminate those who were too utilitarian. The recruitment of clubs had always been a two-way process. Those who thought that they had eliminated the Magical Animals Club were actually eliminated by the Magical Animals Club. There was no one in the second grade who was as outstanding and as Buddhist as Katrina Isaiah. Dake vaguely saw the shadow of Claire Kate in Katrina. Auntie Claire in the first and second grades should be like this, right? The dark clouds in the sky grew thicker and thicker. It looked like it was going to rain, but it didn't. The club recruitment was still in full swing. After Dake Dimming grabbed the fourth piece of the puzzle, he glanced at the booth next door more frequently. After Katrina Isaiah filled out the club application form, she moved a stool behind the dragon egg and took out a book from her pouch to study. From the moment she opened the book, the influence of the environment on her was minimized. Dake looked up at the sky from time to time, hoping that it would rain soon so that the seniors' booth next door would be washed away. During this period of time, it was inevitable that some people would come to Brittany Klitschen's recruitment office to ask about it. However, after Brittany Klitschen's explained the nature of the Muppet Dolls Society, almost everyone lost interest. Even if there were one or two people who were interested in sewing dolls, they gave up in the end. Their love for dolls wasn't enough to make them give up on the resources of other clubs. In fact, Brittany Klitschen's club still lacked a lot of things. He didn't know which professor had endorsed her. Dark waited patiently until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The crowd in the venue had been reduced to an exaggerated level. He finally made his move. One had to know that after a while, the dual club's recruitment test would end, and the second grade would flood the venue again. Therefore, now was the best time to make a move. Dark took the initiative to walk to the booth next door, and sat down at the table. Good afternoon, senior. Brittany Klitschen's wasn't in a good mood. No one would be in a good mood if they didn't find a single new member after waiting for an entire afternoon. However, she still said politely, Good afternoon, Junior Dimmung. Do you need my help? Dake thought for a moment before asking, Senior, what's your name? Brittany said, Brittany Klitschen's third grade House of Fools. So it's Senior Klitschen's. Dake looked at the tattered teddy bear on the table and said, Senior, you seem to have a soft spot for dolls. Brittany looked a little depressed, but she still said, When I was young, my mother would sew all kinds of dolls for me. It was probably from then on that I fell in love with these little cuties. Unfortunately, dolls are just a child's hobby. Perhaps it's time for me to grow up. Dake frowned and said, Age doesn't matter. It's human nature to like cute things. Senior Dake, you don't have to think too much. Brittany's eyes lit up again. She asked, Junior Dimmung, do you like dolls as well? Dake nodded and said, Of course I do. However, I might not like the dolls themselves, but the other value that comes with them. Brittany was confused. What do you mean? Dake said, For example, I like the Sky Dragon doll. However, it's the Sky Dragon that attracts me, not the doll. Brittany couldn't help but frown and think carefully. But after a while she suddenly said, But the Sky Dragon doll is still a doll. Dake smiled. That's true. As the conversation went on, Brittany found that her mind was gradually opening up, and her mood was improving before she knew it. The junior in front of her seemed to have mastered the most advanced communication skills, and he could always resolve the awkwardness without anyone noticing. Even though the two of them had only just met, she actually felt like they were having a pleasant conversation. To be honest, Brittany felt that this junior was a little scary. So, when he suddenly handed her a club application form, after they chatted for half an hour, she knew that he must have been planning this for a long time. However, Dake didn't hide this. He said with the application form, "Senior Klitschens, I'm sure you've seen it. My club is still short of one member to make up the 5 members. If you can help me, not only will you have a place to stay without any restrictions, but you'll also get one of my favorites." "One of my favorites? Are you talking about yourself?" asked Brittany with a smile. Dake blinked. "I'm talking about Deanna, the one who wants to take away your bear." "Her?" Brittany recalled. "But like you said, she might like bears, not dolls." Dake said, "That's not a conflict." Brittany said, "I know. She might like dolls too. However, your Fantastic Animal Club isn't very attractive to me. Even if my club can't be established, I won't consider yours." "That's a shame." Dake waved his hand, and Meow Meow climbed onto his lap obediently and narrowed its eyes in happiness. Brittany couldn't help but look at Meow Meow again. Dake said slowly, "What do you think? Don't you want to be a Meow Meow doll? Apart from Meow Meow, I have more cuties here." On this day, Brittany Krasinski succumbed to her despicable desires and signed a humiliating contract, selling herself to the demon god. The 5th puzzle piece is in my hands. Dake carefully put away the 4 club application form, rolled up the poster, and had the lion beast carry the signboard. Then he left the venue valiantly. He had to disband the doll club with Brittany Krasinski before he could register her into the Fantastic Animal Club. The student council had increased the number of staff members to deal with the related matters, so it didn't take long for them to get it done. Brittany Christian, on the other hand, had to go and talk to her club director. Therefore, Dake arranged for them to meet at the castle gate at 8 p.m. and head to Travelers Street for the first time since the establishment of the Fantastic Animal Club. The reason it was 8 p.m. was because Luosi was still participating in the Duel Club's recruitment competition. After Dake packed his things, he hurried to Battle Hall 1. The number of spectators in Battle Hall 1 was more than in previous years. The Battle Hall was filled with an anxious atmosphere. Dake found Deanna and Luosi outside of Battle Hall 2 and met up with them. Deanna was the first to notice him. Her eyes lit up as she nudged Luosi's arm. Luosi was watching the battle, while replenishing her magic card. She was so shocked by Deanna's sudden nudge that she dropped the magic card in her hand. She quickly reached her hand down, and magic light flashed on her fingertips. The magic card was enveloped by magic and pulled back into her hand. This simple method of controlling magic power caused Dark, who was approaching, to involuntarily focus his attention. Luosi's talent in magic manipulation was beyond his expectations. "Dake, have you recruited everyone?" Deanna moved her little but to make room for Dake. Dake sat down and replied, "Yes, I've recruited everyone. You've seen the 2 new recruits." Deanna blinked and guessed. "One of them is the doll girl next door to the recruitment area. The other one, let me think." Seema. Dake's heart was obvious. Dake was a little speechless. However, Deanna probably wouldn't be able to guess who the other person was. After all, they had only met Katerina Isaiah 3 months ago. Deanna had probably forgotten all about her. As expected, Deanna rattled off a dozen names, but she didn't mention Katerina. Finally, she couldn't go on. She suddenly took out a limited edition candy wrapped in exquisite candy paper from her pocket and placed it in Dake's palm. Dake looked up and said, Deanna smiled foolishly and said, "I'll buy your information with a candy." Dake was immediately amused. He didn't keep her in suspense and said, "Do you remember the girl from the Sorcerer's Institute that we met on the magic car 3 months ago? That's her." Deanna racked her brain for a long time and finally seemed to remember. She quickly put on a look of realization and said, "Oh, it's her." At that moment, the referee's voice spread through the stadium through the loudspeaker. Number 36, please get ready to enter the arena." "Number 36 is Luosi," Deanna said excitedly. Luosi nodded and said, "It's my turn." She focused her eyes and walked confidently to the arena. Dake looked at her straight back and felt that she was completely different. Dake couldn't help but ask, How's Luoce's record? Deanna heard him and said excitedly. Of course it's a complete victory. You don't know, but Luoce is really strong. I might not even be her match. Luoce Flotty's reputation seemed to have been shown in the previous duels. Her appearance caused a lot of cheers to erupt from the crowd. Her opponent, a boy from the Noble Academy who was also a second-year student, was clearly nervous. Although this boy had also improved during the holidays compared to Luoce, he was clearly on a different level. Before today, the second-year students would never have thought that the timid little girl who was always by Dake's side could be so strong. From the beginning, this duel was completely one-sided. The healing light that was constantly sprinkled from the sky made Luoce's initial magic fairy into an impregnable fortress. No matter how the boy attacked, it didn't fall. After Luoce summoned her second flying magic fairy, she directly stretched out her hand and pointed at the magic ball opposite her. Her long-range magic power control that spanned the entire field was even more proficient than the boy's close-range magic power control. Before he could concentrate his magic, the magic ball was pulled to a position close to the center by Luoce. In a situation where the distance between the two parties and the magic ball was almost the same, the boy's level of magic control was completely crushed by Luoce, and losing control of the magic ball meant losing everything. There was almost no suspense. Luoce obtained a clean victory once again, and anyone with a discerning eye could see that she hadn't displayed her true strength. Facing the cheers of the crowd, Luoce walked down the stage. Her cheeks were slightly red, but she was still hiding her shyness. She lowered her head slightly, walked a few steps, and sat back on the bench. Deanna immediately applauded her. Rose hurriedly grabbed her hand and grumbled, "You're the same." Clap, clap, clap. Dake also raised his hand and clapped twice. Luoce immediately blushed and said, "Annoying, Omega." In the first dual club recruitment competition of the new semester, the second year of the Noble Courtyard, Luoce Flotty was undoubtedly the most dazzling star. But she wasn't the only one who was shining. Saraswati's hardcore supporter, Heidi Euphemia, the owner of the Eyes of the Stars, Eudora Veen, Little Fatty Pitan, including the House of Fools, there were people who were exceptionally outstanding in the four branches. The level of the second year's Little Magisters had clearly taken a big step forward. And the increase in the average level also made some people who were lagging behind very conspicuous. Luoboat Broheim seemed to have spent the 3 months of vacation completely on improving his own physical strength, completely forgetting that his core essence was that of a magister who led the generation. He was beaten up almost every time he didn't use the magic elven card left by the vampire Vlad. Although the dual club's recruitment test wasn't based on victory or defeat, it was very likely that he would be one of the 20% who would be eliminated. As night fell, the rain that had accumulated all day in the dark clouds suddenly poured down. The whole castle was washed by the sudden rainstorm. But the rainstorm came and went quickly, and in just 5 or 6 minutes, it completely stopped. And in Hall 1, the results of the dual club's recruitment test were finally out. Most of the students who worked hard passed the test with an 80% passing rate. Luoce Flotty passed the test without any suspense. But the one who won first place was a third-year senior. But Dake didn't care about this. He and Deanna congratulated Luoce for passing the test, and caught a glimpse of White and Luoboat hugging each other. He wondered which club they would choose in the end, and then unknowingly walked out of the hall. Luoce had already received the badge representing the dual club. From now on, she was also an honorable duelist. She put the duel badge on her chest, and recalled the appearance of Deanna when she received the duel badge for the first time. She also blushed and asked Dake, "Does it look good?" "Of course it looks good." Dake's answer was as usual. On the other side, Professor Mitya appeared outside the hall, and showed an expression of approval to Eudora. Doran hugged Piston tightly, but he didn't move. Sarah was congratulating Heidi. AI Ma was comforting Lucy, who passed the test, and Susan, who didn't pass the test. Lucy and Susan met in the last round of the duel assessment, and Lucy won. Dake and the other two left the happiness and sorrow of the Little Magisters behind them, and walked briskly to the castle gate to meet the new club members. Katrina and Brittany were both third years, and one was from the School of Magic, and the other was from the Fool's Academy. They usually had classes in the same classroom, but the two were obviously not familiar with each other. At this time, they were also sitting on two sides. One was reading a book, and the other was sewing a doll. They were very focused. They didn't think about what to do next, but the big wave was already behind them. 8 and 116,000 plus, 175/233 new monthly votes increased by 1,500 plus, rounded to 2,000, adding 2,000 to the 14,000. Finally finished. Sleep. It's the last day of the month, and it's time to take back the first place on the monthly list. Everyone, please vote for us. There are still 6 months to go before the 12th consecutive monthly votes, please know. On the last day, let's recycle the blades that are about to expire _ smiley face, angle, _ Chapter 553. Although the storm had stopped, the ground was still wet, and the sound of footsteps could be heard clearly. Katrina and Brittany heard the sound and looked up at almost the same time. They were very lucky to be able to join the mystical animal society founded by Dake Dimung. Among this batch of third-year students, there weren't any exceptions like Winnie Scardy or Panduola Doragon. Compared to the other years, they were relatively mediocre. However, Katrina and Brittany weren't considered top students even among this batch. In comparison, Katrina Isaiah's results were considered good, but Brittany Christian's results were considered below average. They weren't qualified to be recruited by large societies. Due to the limited resources and the need to distribute them, large societies would consciously limit the number of people they recruited. For example, the Literature Society would only recruit 4 people each year. Only the most outstanding people would be chosen by the Literature Society. Katrina and Brittany obviously didn't have this qualification. Remember the URL. MVIP, can't you? VIP. Taking a step back, a new society with great potential like the Mystical Animal Society was the best choice they could find. Katrina had taken this into consideration, which was why she took the initiative to respond. Brittany, on the other hand, realized how lucky she was after giving it some thought, and built a sense of belonging because of it. Looks like Flottie's test was very successful? Katrina closed her book and stood up to welcome them. Thanks to the 3 days of traveling together, she was quite familiar with Deanna and Luosi. Senior Isaiah, just call me Luosi. Then you can call me Katrina. And me Deanna. With Katrina taking the initiative to welcome them, the 3 of them quickly became familiar with each other. Dake went to Brittany and introduced her to Deanna and Luosi. A few minutes later, Dake waved his hand and said, "Since everyone is here, let's go." The group entered Traveler's Street through the hub of the pavilion in the middle of the lake. They found a high-end restaurant and sat down to order. Tonight, Traveler's Street was very lively. The second-year freshmen who had passed the dual club's assessment came in groups of 3 to 5 to celebrate. Some clubs would also hold a welcoming dinner for the newcomers tonight. If they had come any later, they might not even have been able to get a seat. The 5 members of the club were already familiar with each other when they were passing by, so they weren't unfamiliar with each other at all. Although Katerina liked to sit alone in a quiet corner and read quietly, her social skills were not bad. She easily integrated into the crowd. On the other hand, Brittany's social skills were almost zero. She rarely initiated conversations and mostly answered questions passively. Fortunately, there was Deanna, who had maxed out her natural friendly skill, and the 2 of them had reached a subtle consensus about their love for teddy bears. Their conversation became smoother and smoother. Besides, Deanna did learn how to knit during the holidays. Although she always failed, she could ask Brittany for advice. On the other side, Luosi, who enjoyed reading novels and biographies, and Katrina, who read everything, were chatting with each other. As for Dake Dimung, he had a good memory and an elegant way of speaking, so he could join in on anything. As the saying goes, one may know a person for a long time without understanding their true nature. He was also consciously observing Katerina and Brittany's characters. Excluding the overly noisy environment, this banquet was quite enjoyable for the guests. After dinner, the 5 of them wandered around the night market of Traveler Street. They ate some snacks and watched some shows. The atmosphere became more and more harmonious. When it was almost 10 o'clock, Dake waved his hand and returned to the academy with the girls through the pavilion in the middle of the lake. They did not split up and return to their dormitories. Instead, they climbed up the spiral clock tower and arrived at the Magical Animals Club's classroom together for the first time. It was the 10th floor of the spiral clock tower. Good heavens! Is this the ultimate enjoyment? Katerina tapped her aching legs, but there was a hint of excitement in her eyes. Come to think of it, the Magical Animals Club's classroom was not only the tallest among all the club's classrooms, it was also located in the center of the castle. This obviously symbolized some kind of status. At the very least, she had never heard of a club setting up their classroom in the clock tower. Standing in the corridor outside the classroom, one could see the scenery of the entire castle. It was as if the height of one's soul was rising. If I put a deck chair in the corridor and drank black tea every afternoon while enjoying the scenery in the book. No, I can't stand it anymore. Katerina quickly shook her head with a greedy look on her face. Did you think of something good to eat, Katerina? Deanna asked curiously. Katerina turned her head awkwardly. Yes. Unfortunately, being tall had its disadvantages. Going up and down 10 floors every day was quite tiring. Not all dueling classes had such strict requirements for physical fitness. The third-year dueling classes were relatively lax. They believed that there was no point in increasing one's physical fitness too much. Instead, they relied on magic cards to make the magisters faster and last longer. This was obvious from Katerina and Brittany's performance. Brittany's physical fitness was even weaker. Of course, the most tired one was Luosi, who had just started her physical fitness training. Just as well, going up and down the stairs every day will be part of your physical fitness training. Dake smiled at Luosi. When your physical fitness training is effective, you can add weight training or jump up the stairs while squatting. Luosi's face turned pale. The night sky after the storm was unusually clear. The moon was too shy to be seen, and the stars shone brightly. The five of them walked slowly along the circular corridor, and finally gathered in the club classroom. Although the club classroom had been cleaned, there was nothing left except for the tables and chairs piled up in the corner. If they wanted to make it more comfortable, they would have to add more bricks and tiles. Although you can use any of the 6 classrooms on the 10th floor, our main location is still this classroom facing the House of Nobles Tower in the southwest. To make it easier to distinguish, we will mark it as number 1. We will also put a number on it later. Dake walked around the classroom, and finally got to the main topic of the day. Number 1. Classroom is our club activity area. You can add furniture and decorate as you wish. For example, Katrina can add a reading room there, and Brittany can add a doll display room on the other side. Deanna and Luosi can also add their own facilities. Yay, Candy House. Anyway, we will meet at the clock tower at 8 tomorrow morning. That will be our fixed meeting place from now on. We still have 2 days this weekend, so we need to renovate this club classroom as soon as possible. As for the cost, come to me the night after tomorrow when we meet up. Any objections? No. Okay, then follow me to the other classrooms. Dake clapped his hands and led the club members out of number 1. They walked clockwise to the right and arrived at number 2. What will this classroom be used for? Katrina asked. Dake said, Number 2. Classroom and number 6. Classroom are adjacent to number 1. We can't use them for personal purposes. My idea is to use number 1. Classroom to house magical animals, and number 6. Classroom to be a collection room, or rather a warehouse. Magical animals? Brittany's ears perked up as if she received a signal. Her eyes widened. Katrina was also surprised. Our club really has magical animals? Dake smiled. Of course. Magical Animals Club is the only club in the academy that is allowed to raise magical animals. Although I didn't fight for this privilege, it will always be a club feature. Katrina couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. Ha! Brittany, on the other hand, grew excited. She loved cute things and, of course, she loved sewing cute things into dolls. Magical animals usually gave people the impression that they were harmless or cute. As for those that were harmful or uncute, they were mostly treated as magical beasts. Dake didn't tell them that he had obtained a bird egg for the time being. He planned to announce it as a surprise after it hatched successfully. Our club's meeting time is similar to the other clubs. It's on Wednesday afternoon. If there's an activity on Wednesday afternoon, it will be postponed to the evening, or we'll notify you later. Apart from that, we're relatively free. Give me your academy card to register. As Dark walked, he logged in the information of the other 4 members in the society card, and continued. Raising and researching magical animals is the club's research topic, and the only requirement of the club. We need to complete a research report before the end of every semester. Based on the grade of the research results, we'll be able to apply for the corresponding resources and credits every semester. This is our club's current basic income. By the way, when the club is first established, we'll receive 1,000 credits as a club fund. Dake waved the club card in his hand, indicating that the 1,000 credits had been transferred. The club fund will be our reserve fund. If you need anything, you can apply for it from me. Apart from that, Katrina and Brittany should know better than me how to earn credits. Of course, our club is different from the other clubs. We won't force our members to complete a certain number of club missions every month. However, everyone's contribution to the club will be converted into points, which will be recorded. Dake raised his hand, and the magic card between his fingers lit up, and a thick grimoire appeared. "Greet everyone," Dake said. The magician's secretary bowed to Katerina and Brittany. "Points equals credits. You can apply for them, or use them for internal purchases. As the club continues to develop, we'll produce more and more products with our club's characteristics. Most of these products will be placed in a shop on Traveler's Street for sale. A small number of them will only be available internally. Club members can purchase them with points. Of course, they'll be sold internally. Additionally, the club will also provide interest-free loans for a certain period of time to solve the club members' urgent needs. Lastly, there's one more thing. It's the biggest difference between our club and the other clubs." Dake walked into Classroom 3 and said, "Classroom 3 will be used as the study room for the magical fairy, my magical fairy. Classroom 4, which is opposite Classroom 1, will be the magical fairy's room. Classroom 5, which is next door, will be the magical fairy's activity room. In other words, half of the 10th floor belongs to the magical fairy." Dake turned around and smiled at the club members. Deanna and Luosi weren't surprised at all, but Katrina and Brittany were. Even though Dake's magical fairies were appearing more and more frequently in the academy, not many people really knew about them. However, Katrina and Brittany's surprise was more focused on Dake's attitude toward the magical fairies. Dake said with a calm expression, "On the surface, our magical zoology club only has 5 members, but that's not the case. Every one of my magical fairies will participate in club activities as a member. They also have credits and points, and they'll spend a lot of time in the club's classrooms." In fact, Dake was planning to apply for a commercial academy card for every magical fairy. The commercial academy cards only had the functions of storing, transferring credits, and receiving important notifications from the academy. It could be said that it was a simplified version of the real academy card. Because of the single function, the commercial academy card was unlimited. With the business edition academy card, the magic guide fairies would have their own financial power, and they could be regarded as individuals in the true sense of the word. Dake would also open up a little red flower exchange system, allowing the magical fairies to exchange little red flowers for credits. Then, they could complete the Academy's club missions to earn credits and contribute to the club. If Dake could develop a portable, miniature paradise, the magical fairies might be able to accept dungeon-related missions and go on an adventure. However, the design of the miniature paradise was still an idea. If he wanted to extract the mana recovery factor from zoo or paradise and make it stable while moving, there were too many technical hurdles to overcome. In fact, if it was that simple, the magical fairy's mana recovery wouldn't be a problem. For example, if healing skills were repeatedly used in a short period of time, the magical fairies would develop resistance to it, causing the healing effect to decrease. These were unavoidable factors. Zoo and Paradise used the circuit between the venue and the magical fairies to form an energy cycle, giving the magical fairies additional mana recovery ability. It seemed like a simple theory, but it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Dake's current idea was to use paradise as a foundation and develop a supplementary card for paradise. Perhaps this would reduce the difficulty. Basically, this would be his research topic for the next few years. And before the miniature paradise was developed, the magic elves could only take on some missions within the academy to train themselves. As their wisdom grew and their understanding of the world deepened, they would develop more spiritual and material needs. Clothing, jewelry, toys, books, candy, and snacks could all be obtained. After visiting all 6 classrooms, Dake explained his club's philosophy. Katerina and Brittany finally knew what kind of club they would be joining. The two of them looked at each other in dismay, their hearts slightly shaken. Even though they didn't join the Magical Animal Club for a strong club, they couldn't help but hope that their club would become better after joining. The Magical Animal Club gave them more expectations than they had expected. Click! Dake locked the classroom door and led the club members downstairs. It was already late at night, and the surroundings were silent. As they walked down the spiral staircase, they could see figures carrying books through the windows of the castle. The students would usually return to their dorms before 11 o'clock, or they would be warned by the patrolling golems. After 12 o'clock, they would be locked out. The 5 members of the Magical Animal Club parted at the staircase on the 2nd floor of the castle. After saying goodnight to each other, they went to their respective dorm towers. Katerina was a student of the Magic Institute. Brittany was a student of the House of Fools. Dake, Katerina, and Katerina were from the House of Nobles. Even though the 4 schools were at odds with each other on the surface, apart from a few clubs such as the Aristocratic History Research Club, most of the clubs were open to the whole school. If the club wanted to grow, the cooperation between the 4 schools was crucial. This contradictory setting kept the relationship between the students of St. Marianne in a very delicate state of balance. After Dake entered the tower, he high-fived Deanna and returned to his dorm. He didn't rest immediately. Instead, with the help of Secretary of the Magic Institute, he created a file for the club members. This file was an internal file and wouldn't be shown to the public, but it would be updated in real time. Only by understanding the specific situation of each club member could the club continue to improve. What determined the strength of a club wasn't the number of people or the size, but the strength of the members. That night, Dake hugged Uncaught Bird's egg and slept soundly. However, the other 4 members of the Magical Animal Club didn't sleep well. Girls seemed to have a special fondness for decorations, whether it was their own decorations or the decorations of their rooms. While Dake was meeting Dream Demon in his dream, the 4 girls were sitting at the main table and thinking about the design of the club's classroom. They didn't sleep until 1 or 2 in the morning. The next day was Saturday. When Dake arrived at the Spiral Clock Tower 10 minutes early, he found that none of his club members had arrived. After waiting for a long time, the club members finally arrived one by one. "Can't you at least be on time for the first meeting?" Dake couldn't help but complain. "Well, I'm not late, right?" Deanna, who arrived at 7:59, said confidently with her chest puffed out. Lucy, who arrived in front of Dake a second earlier, snickered. Katrina and Brittany stood on the side, waiting for Dake to give the order. Dake waved his hand. "Then let's go." The group once again rushed into Traveler's Street. They ran from shop to shop according to their own plans, constantly moving their favorite furniture and furnishings into the clock tower. Dake didn't move with them. Instead, he took out his own shopping list and started shopping crazily. After a whole day of shopping crazily, he moved everything he needed back to his dorm and lay on his bed, his muscles aching. Among all the things he bought, the most important were the refining materials for Curse Cage. He bought 3 sets of refining materials that cost more than 1,500 credits each. Other than that, he also bought a set of materials for fusion for further research. In addition, he had also spent 2,000 credits to buy a magic dowel tool. Magic props were extremely expensive, and the ones that were bought with 2,000 credits were only barely usable. This magic tool was called Windwheel. After activating it with magic, it could create a huge tunnel of wind, which suited Dake's needs. He planned to install Windwheel at the entrance of Club 1's classroom. It was usually facing the tower of the aristocrat house, and when necessary, it could also transmit the fragrance to other coordinates to ensure a stable transmission in a windless or rainy environment. Windwheel didn't consume much magic power. It could be used continuously after charging once every 3 days. On Sunday morning, the 5 members of the Magical Zoology Society rushed into Traveler's Street again. Dake summoned his magic elf. Under the shocked gazes of the students on the street, he moved brand new beds onto the spiral clock tower and arranged them neatly. The classroom on the 10th floor of the clock tower was much taller and bigger than the dorm. Dake used planks as partitions and divided the 12-meter wide and 20-meter wide classrooms into 3-meter wide and 4-meter long rooms. There were 12 small rooms that were 3 by 4, 2 middle rooms that were 6 by 4, and 1 large room that was 6 by 8. Each small room could fit 2 beds and a set of tables and cabinets. 2 or more small magic elves could live in each room. Magic elves like the Lion Beast and the Green-Eyed Wyrem could live in the middle-sized rooms, while the large 6 by 8 room would be allocated to the large magic elves in the future. Dake opened Paradise in the center and summoned all the magic elves. He then let them choose their rooms according to their wishes. Although the rooms were simple and crude, they would gradually be decorated in the future to improve the environment. However, Dake was more worried that some of the magic elves might not be willing to live here. Moreover, the signs of this situation were already very obvious. He lowered his head and looked at Fairy Ibu, who was tightly wrapping a ribbon around his arm. He felt a headache coming on. Let's decorate first. When the time comes, you can live anywhere you want. You also want your own room, don't you? Dake guided patiently. Me. Fairy Ibu shook her head vigorously. Little guy, do you think I can't see through your stalling tactics? Dake immediately glared. Go. Me. Fairy Ibu then slowly loosened the ribbon and turned around to wrap around little Ibu, dragging it into the room. Although Fairy Ibu always liked to bully Ibu, they were still a rare species among the magic elves. Their relationship was like that of a big sister and a little sister. If it had to find a magic elven to live with, it would undoubtedly choose Ibu. With these 2 magic elves taking the lead, the other magic elves also walked into classroom number 4 one after another. The Green-Eyed Wyrem bit its finger and followed suit. Among all the magic elves, its body was the largest. It simply couldn't stretch out in Dake's dormitory. It could be said that it was the one with the greatest need for this new room. Next would be the Lion Beast. In Dake's dormitory, there wasn't even a bed for the Lion Beast. The 2 of them naturally occupied one of the middle-sized rooms. Dake observed the behavior of the magic elves with great interest. From this kind of allocation, it was basically possible to see the depth of the relationship between the magic elves. For example, the multiform freak didn't hesitate to carry the slime trash into a room, and conveniently pulled the fruit-nibbling bug in as well. These 3 fellows would probably live in the same room. As for Hoo-Hoo and Big Milk Can, they formed the senior team and entered the same room. In addition, Chio-Chio Sea Lion and Wrestling Hawkman, as the magic elves that joined the group at the same time, naturally walked together. Meow Meow unwillingly formed a team with the Dream Demon, for the same reason. As for the Diru Beast and the Little Fiend Magic Beast, the Diru Beast casually grabbed the scabbard in its hand, then looked left and right. It looked at the Demon Fox Beast and walked into the same room. The 3 of them formed the Icy team. In this way, only the Little Fiend Magic Beast, Little Snorlax and the Magic Elven Secretary were left. The Little Fiend Magic Beast looked at Little Snorlax and the Magic Elven Secretary with a dumbfounded expression, but it discovered that the 2 magic elves had already looked at each other. It immediately became anxious, thinking, why is this Little Snorlax so blind? We are all juniors, shouldn't we be able to form the little team? And you, the Magic Elven Secretary, why are you joining in the fun with this book? Isn't it good for you to obediently stay in the bookshelf? Of course it isn't good. Little Snorlax and the Magic Elven Secretary quickly reached a consensus. Then they walked into the same room hand in hand. Little Snorlax, who was either sleeping or eating, and the Magic Elven Secretary, who was either reading or sleeping, were unexpectedly a pair. Yo, Little Fiend Magic Beast, why are you the only one left? Dake leaned against the door frame and looked at the little fiend magic beast with a smile. The little fiend magic beast was originally doing evil, but at this moment, it pulled down the corner of its eyes and threw itself into Dake's arms with an aggrieved look. Dake teased, "Isn't it good for you to live alone?" The little fiend magic beast shook its head. Dake laughed. "Just think of it as leaving half a room for Victoria. Vampire and bat, a perfect match." Wah 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 wah. The little fiend magic beast used impact. Dake Dimming used return punch. The little fiend magic beast died. After a simple allocation of rooms, Dake stuffed 3 rows of bookshelves into classroom number 3 next door. A few sets of tables and chairs for tea were placed on one side of the bookshelves, and the ordinary tables and chairs were placed in front of the bookshelves. In this way, a study room was completed. As for the activity room number 5, it was temporarily empty. After that, he might put in the Hawkman's wooden dummies, or he might get a set of targets and wooden weapons. After that, Dake went to classroom number 1. As the real classroom of the Magical Animal Society, classroom number 1 was basically the place where the members of the society did their daily activities, so it was very important. When Dake pushed open the door and entered, he saw Deanna moving the magically bonded wooden wall inside. This kind of wooden wall was very heavy, and ordinary people couldn't move it at all. However, in Deanna's hands, it seemed to be weightless. After she placed the wooden wall in a suitable place according to Katarina's instructions, she continued to pour magic power into it. The places where the wooden wall was in contact with the wall, ceiling, and floor quickly became sticky, and they were firmly stuck together. Deanna clapped her hands, showed a satisfied smile, and continued to move the wooden wall. This kind of magically bonded wooden wall could be said to be a specialty of Traveler Street, and it was often used to decorate the society. Not only was it easy to install, but it was also very sturdy after being glued together, and the soundproofing effect was also very good. The surface of the wooden wall was also coated with a waterproof and fireproof coating, so it was relatively safe. Most societies would use this kind of wall to divide the large classrooms into small offices or lounges. The dormitory of the elves in classroom number 4 was also separated by this kind of magically bonded wooden wall. Dake walked into the classroom and looked inside. He found that the whole classroom was basically finished, and cute door signs were hung on the doors of many rooms. At a glance, the most eye-catching one was the president's office, which was Dake's room. Opposite the president's office was the meeting room. Then there was the reception room, study room, doll room, candy house, healing room, lounge, storage room, bathroom. Basically, everyone had their own room. And all the rooms that a society should have were also available. Looking at these rooms, Dake suddenly realized one thing. This classroom of the society was completely livable. The other societies were unable to live in it because of the patrolling golems in the castle. But for the first time, their society's classroom was located on top of a spiral clock tower. The golem's tentacles could not reach here. This way, after closing time, there will be a place to go. Dake could not help but whisper. Then he greeted Deanna and the others and entered the president's office. Although the door sign was hung, the interior decoration of the president's office was extremely simple. It could even be said that there was no decoration at all. Dake was busy arranging the living quarters and study rooms for the elves, so he did not have time to take care of himself. But now he could spend some time to design it properly. 8:30 in the evening, the preliminary arrangement of the society's classroom was completed. While the 5 of them were excited, they also felt very tired. They simply went to the cafeteria to eat something, and then announced that they were dismissed. Only Dake returned to the society's classroom alone and faced the elves. Dake took a deep breath and looked serious. The elves also looked serious, as if they were facing a great enemy. Cough. Finally, after Dark coughed, he said with a serious expression, "Then those who have decided to live in the society's dormitory, raise your hand first." Roar. Pride. Young green-eyed dragon raised its hand first. It had already fallen in love with its own room and wide bed. The lion beast took a deep breath and also slowly raised its hand. Dake withdrew his gaze from them, and then looked at the other elves. The choice of the large duo was expected. After all, there was not enough space in room 301 to accommodate them. The problem now was the other elves. Dake's mood at this moment was like a parent urging his children to sleep in separate rooms. He hoped that his children could gradually become independent, but he could not bear to be separated from them. After half a minute of silence, Little Dream Demon suddenly raised its hand. Dake subconsciously glared at it. When Little Dream Demon was about to withdraw its hand with a face full of suspicion, he hurriedly said, "It's okay." Thus, Little Dream Demon raised its hand straight again. Nibble, when it thought that it could finally escape from Dake's eyes and enjoy the free nights from now on, its heart was in a panic. After its roommate saw it raise its hand, its original posture of crossing its chest slowly changed and gradually raised its hand. At this moment, it was no longer the meow meow of the past. It did not want to escape from Dake's side at all, but it thought that it was a mature meow meow. It was time to be independent. Moo moo. Big Milk can suddenly asked a question. The multiform's body shape quickly changed and quickly turned into little Dake's appearance. It then translated. "It wants to ask you what about the cat grass and worm tree." Dake squinted his eyes and said, "If it's the cat grass, you can put a few in the club classroom. After all, 5 cat grass in the dormitory is a bit too much. As for the worm tree, you can keep it in the dormitory." Moo moo moo. Big Milk patted its chest and said. The multiform continued to translate. "If you need to move the cat grass to the club classroom, you can move it here and be responsible for cultivating it. Big Milk is as reliable as always." Dake was instantly gratified. "Then move the lion grass, cow grass, and dragon grass to the club classroom. Keep the fox grass and cat grass in the dormitory." The fox grass and cat grass were the closest to each other, especially the original cat grass. Dake suddenly realized that it could no longer leave it. After Big Milk made its decision, its roommate, Teacher Kettle, retracted its head, tail, and tentacles back into its shell, its ears not listening to anything outside its shell. It obviously didn't want to move out of the dormitory at all. Also, it wanted to make juice for its master every day. After that, the room fell into silence again. Dake looked at the faces of the magic elves one by one. When his gaze fell on the eagle wrestling man's hands, it looked cold and raised its wings. "Hacha." Dake, multiform. The multiform translated at the same time. "It's busy," it said, to put more training equipment in the activity room and move out of the dormitory. "No problem." Dake nodded. "This is also planned." "Then who else?" Little Sea Lion tilted its head. "Momo?" The multiform. "Is there a pool in the dormitory?" Dake shook its head. "After setting paradise in the club classroom, there is no pool in the dormitory. If you like, I can set up a fountain in the middle of the classroom and a small pool in your room." "Emo." Little Sea Lion's eyes lit up and it nodded vigorously. Obviously, a fountain pool was right on its good side. In this way, Little Sea Lion and the eagle wrestling man also agreed to move out. There were a total of 7 magic elves. This number had already exceeded Dake's expectations. He couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. Among the remaining magic elves, they were basically smaller in size. Even if they lived in the dormitory, it wouldn't be a big problem. However, he originally thought that the demon fox would take the opportunity to move out, but he didn't expect that the demon fox would pretend to be dead the whole time. As soon as he turned his gaze, the demon fox would immediately look away, and as the big sister, the Diru beast didn't have the slightest intention of setting an example. However, with the lion here, Dake was more at ease. Then who else? Dake waited for 3 minutes. After confirming that no one else was willing to move out, he said, "It doesn't matter where we live. Our future activities will basically be here. Even if you live with me, you have to wake up early every day and go to the club classroom to study like you go to school. Then, at night, you have to go back to the dormitory to sleep. In fact, this is more troublesome." But even though he patiently explained, the remaining magic elves simply ignored him. Fairy Ibu and Little Ibu didn't need to be mentioned. Trash Slime always remembered its masked duty. It couldn't be separated from the polymorph. And now, the fruit-gnawing bug had also become the polymorph's little follower. It could be said that apart from the little devil and Ibu, Kettle was the magic elven that had been with Dake the longest. Even if he had to climb 100 floors every day, he wouldn't be willing to leave. And the single scabbard followed the Diru beast. Little Snorlax was simply too lazy to move. The magic elven secretary preferred to be held in Dake's hands and read, Diru beast meow. Omega? #Ka-Meng. Just when Dake thought that the dust had settled, little Snorlax suddenly raised its hand. Dake was delighted and asked, Polymorph. The polymorph immediately imitated little Snorlax's voice and said, If you have to come here every day and go back to sleep, then Snorlax will sleep here. To put it simply, it was too lazy to move its nest. But as long as it could concentrate on studying when it needed to, it didn't matter if it was lazy. Dake nodded and said, If that's the case, then there are 8 magic elves. Those who agree to move to the club dormitory don't have to worry. Moving the dormitory isn't compulsory. If you want to go back to live, you can do so at any time. Then let's stop here for tonight. Let's see if you can adapt. Then he didn't leave the club's classroom. Instead, he stayed in classroom 4 and told the magic elves a story for the whole night. Only then did he return to the dormitory before the curfew. After returning to the dormitory, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the suddenly empty bedroom. His heart suddenly felt empty, and he was startled. Meow. Fairy Ibu came over and wrapped a ribbon around his arm, feeling his emotions. Little Ibu pounced and nestled on Dake's knee. Kettle stretched its neck and looked at him. The polymorph tilted its head. The fruit-gnawing bug on top of its head immediately rolled down, and was caught by it. Trash slime was firmly lying on the ground. The little demon beast flew up to the bird rack and stared at Dake upside down. The single scabbard gently swayed the sword. The magic elven secretary landed beside him. The Dilu beast and the demon fox leaned against the wall, their gazes slanted. Unexpectedly, the first one who couldn't adapt was Dake himself. 5 and 1 10,000 plus, 178/233. Maybe I've been too tired recently. I suddenly woke up after sleeping for 12 hours. I feel like I've recovered a big breath. I can live for a few more years. This is from yesterday. Today's update will still be tomorrow morning. Thank you everyone for your support and care this year. It has been exactly a year since July 31st, 2020. Although I encountered many difficulties during this period, I finally survived. I will continue to work hard in the future. I hope to accompany everyone to go further. In the new month, I will continue to ask for monthly votes and blades. Chapter 554. That night, Dake completed the draw in a daze and immediately fell asleep. When he woke up, his body was covered in fur balls. Taking off the fur ball from his body and putting it aside, he fell into a brief moment of contemplation. 9 days had passed in September, and today was the 10th day. In the first 4 days he drew 4 points of bliss and 4 points of greed. In the last 5 days he drew 2 points of pride, 6 points of bliss, and 2 points of greed. There was no purpose in it. It was just that bliss was easier to increase, and pride and greed had more to spare. Unsurprisingly, today was the last day, and he would draw greed again. This way, after eliminating the 3 points of bliss and 3 points of greed, he would have 2 points of pride, 7 points of bliss, and 5 points of greed left. His original plan of researching the 4th great sin had to be put on hold. As the daily draw was reduced to 2 points, the overflow of great sin was clearly not enough, and he would need to add more materials to get it. Remember, https://m, Vipcanchu, VIP gradually accumulating bliss, would make people want to try making a new Bliss 3. However, after careful consideration, Dake realized that the new Bliss 3 would only bring about a limited increase. The new Great Sins 2 had a huge increase in power because it could provide Ivan with a specific field skill. However, Great Sins 3 would not bring about that. Compared to the 10 points of bliss, the addition of a few killing moves would not change the nature of the skill. Thus, instead of making Bliss 3, he might as well try Pit of Bliss. Even if the Pit of Bliss was only an incomplete version, it still had its meaning. Through many experiments and tests, He could make more improvements and adjustments to the new refining method. Moreover, bliss was the easiest to accumulate. After all, the desire to reproduce was the nature of living things. Dake shook his head and decided to leave it at that for the time being. Then, he raised his head and fell backward in a daze, allowing his consciousness to be drowned by Furball. It was 3 in the morning. Beep! The branch card. As caller ID woke most of the second-year students up from their dreams. Dake got up and took out the branch card from his card bag. He saw a reward flashing on the card. He clicked on the. It was indeed a new timetable. Compared to last week's class schedule, 2 electives were added to this new schedule. They were Alchemy by Professor Kazair and Astrology by Professor Mitya Bartholomew. We're lucky. They're all on Thursday. Dake took a deep breath of fresh air to wake himself up. Starting from the 2nd grade, the students' main classes were concentrated on Monday to Wednesday, while the elective classes were distributed on Thursday to Friday, or inserted in the first 3 nights. He passed the 2 electives he chose without a doubt. Professor Kazair and Professor Mitya did not reply to his application. I wonder how Deanna and Luosi are doing? With that thought in mind, Dake washed up and applied the facial mask in one go. After that, he changed into casual clothes for morning exercise, and pushed open the dormitory door. He looked at the corridor all the way to the other end. Most of the second-year students pushed open the door and walked out at this time. With Professor Cheongsi's physical training plan, they no longer had the room to sleep in. Dake took a deep breath and trotted over. He bumped into Deanna and Luosi. Did you receive the new timetable? Yes, perfect. Luosi also nodded obediently. Both of them were indeed students for their respective electives. They signed up early, so there was no reason for them not to pass. I passed too. Eudora, who came out of nowhere, was declaring her presence. Her electives completely overlapped with Dake's. Aima and Sarah were the same. However, Dake was more looking forward to being in the same class as the seniors. Professor Mitya's astrology class was not important for the time being. After all, there were other veteran astrology professors in the academy to choose from. However, Professor Kazair's alchemy class was unique. If there were any seniors who were interested in alchemy, they would most likely rush to enter. In contrast, the threshold for the alchemy class was raised. Those who did not apply early enough or were not outstanding enough might not be able to squeeze into the alchemy class. Of course, Aima and Sarah should not have such concerns. In that case, there would be at least 4 second-year students in the alchemy class. After the morning exercise, Deanna applied magic medicine to Luosi's hands and feet in the bedroom. The magic medicine slowly penetrated into his skin, relieving the soreness and stimulating more strength. After half a week of training, Luosi's physical fitness finally kept up with the pace of the average person. After that, if he gritted his teeth and continued, he would be able to obtain more than the average person's physical fitness. When Deanna was carefully applying the medicine, she complained. Night class and transformation class, none of them overlap with yours. Luosi grimaced. But these are all what you like, aren't they? Okay. Deanna pouted. After I learn how to transform into a bear, I will eat you. Ah. Luosi laughed. Then I will give you an injection after I learn how to inject. Deanna. 3. Lulu. Similar conversations sounded everywhere in the castle. Not only the second-year students, but the seniors also hesitated because of the electives. Students always like to be able to take the same courses as their best friends. But after thinking about it rationally, they would realize that they were not suited for the same courses as their friends. It was right to choose the most suitable electives separately. Just like Saraswati and her hardcore friend Heidi Euphemia, they chose different courses. Sarah chose astrology and alchemy, while Heidi chose astrology and medicine. Yes, her and Luosi's choices overlapped. On the other hand, Dolong Teddy chose night and transformation, which was the same schedule as Deanna, White and Luoboat. Luoboat was not selected for transformation, which made him excited for a long time. Dolong's friend Pitten chose astrology and evocation, which did not overlap with Dolong's. Evocation, was a pure class that taught students how to skillfully use magical power to shape various shapes. It could materialize illusory magical power and give it physical characteristics. Even though the magic hand derived from evocation had limited strength, it could be used to assist in experiments. Basic curses such as magic bullet spell could also be simulated through evocation. Students usually chose evocation to train their magical power control. If used in a duel, it would allow students to have an advantage in pulling the magic conducting ball. Of course, there were also students who used it to improve their physique. For example, filling a certain part with a tangible magical power block could make that part look more majestic. Furthermore, a wizard caster could directly shape magical power into the shape of a weapon, which could replace the fantasy weapon spell after increasing its strength. Dake had considered evocation when he checked the elective course schedule, but he judged that he didn't have a huge need for evocation, and he might be able to self-study in the future without classes. And according to what he knew, one of the 2 elective courses that Eve and Aaron chose was evocation. As for the other elective course, it was magic play. Its full name was Magic Tricks and Deceit Lecture. This course would taste better when eaten together with evocation. The basic content of magic play was to teach wizard casters how to cover themselves with a layer of magical power coating to mislead others' perception of them and achieve the goal of deceiving their opponents. The application techniques derived from this were varied and belonged to the subtle application of magical power. It was very suitable for Eve and Aaron. Professor Earbook finally began the second summoning class of the new semester. As she spoke tirelessly, the little wizard caster's understanding of summoning spells gradually deepened. Professor Kazair also began to explain the theory of magic conduction in depth, gradually unveiling the most mysterious veil of the theory of magic conduction. But because of this, the difficulty of magic introduction increased tremendously. After this step, the little wizard casters who couldn't keep up had to work harder after class. Dake looked at Deanna, who was holding her head in front of him, and held back his laughter. Similarly, potionology, in the afternoon, also began to explain the theoretical knowledge of potionology in depth. The little wizard casters had a basic understanding of potionology after an entire year of study. The next step was to analyze the theory and understand the connection and reaction between each type of potion. Gradually, they would be able to analyze the potions themselves and develop potions. This process would continue all the way until graduation. If they could develop more than 10 universal potion formulas and 1 high-end potion formula before graduation, they could be called a master potionologist. The class time was halved, but the content was twice as difficult. This was a difference of 4 times. The second-year students suddenly looked back and suddenly realized how easy it was for the first-year students. Ring, ring, ring. When the bell for potionology rang, the students quickly packed their bags and rushed out of the classroom as if they were fleeing for their lives. Dake waited until Deanna and Luosi finished packing their bags and prepared to go to the club classroom with them. Occasionally he would hear White and Luoboat talking about the sports club. However, it seemed like only Luoboat joined the sports club. Luoboat was very talkative and excited. It seemed like he did well in the sports club entrance test and was recognized by the seniors. As for White, she joined a club called Marine Biology Research Club. What club is that? Dake tried to recall after the initial shock, but he couldn't find the name of this club in his memory. Even at the club recruitment on Friday, there was no sign of Marine Biology Research Club. A club that doesn't recruit new members. How did White join? Marine Biology. Wait, it can't be that club, right? Dake suddenly remembered the club where all the members wore marine leather gloves, and his expression became strange. In the end, White Gouda didn't betray the Marine Biology Research Club and formed the Marine Biology Research Club with the members of the club. The Marine Biology Research Club had a lot of members, from the 2nd grade to the 6th grade. Due to the misdeeds of the other members of the department, Werther was elected to be the head of the department. That was why White made up his mind. He would rather be the head of a chicken than the tail of a phoenix. After he saw Dark reactivate Magical Animal Society, he felt a sense of competition. As the head of the Marine Biology Club, he would join the competition and lead the members out of the dark corners and back into the light. That was what he said. However, White didn't drag Luoboat down with him. He still supported him in joining the sports club. Luoboat, who successfully entered the night course and transformation course, would definitely have a bright future in the sports club. He would also start to move forward in the second grade, and his speed wouldn't be slow. Dake's eyes moved slightly. Other than White and Luoboat, Aima joined the literature club, and Sarah joined the archaeology club. Sarah's good friend Heidi, Dolan's good friend Pitan, and Eudora all joined the astrology club. As for Dolan himself, he joined the student council. Justin Wayne from the night course also joined the sports club, with Luoboat. The second grade students all walked their own paths. Dake. Yes. Let's go. Okay. Dake picked up his bag and walked out the door. Today was Monday, and he was going to call the club's guidance professor, Lily Laplace, to officially meet the new members. However, his trip wasn't smooth. Lily's office was empty. After knocking on the door for a long time without receiving a response, Dake could only sigh and say, "It seems that I can only postpone it until tomorrow. The first class tomorrow morning is math class, so I'll just let you know then." Deanna asked, "Then we're going to the club classroom now?" Dake nodded and said, "Yes. With the club classroom, there's also another place to do homework. Don't you have a lot of questions about magic theory?" Deanna looked away. "What?" Dake smiled. Let's go. But as soon as he turned his head, a black shadow suddenly hung down from the ceiling. He subconsciously jumped back a step, raised his hand, and slapped him. But just as his palm reached the air, he quickly stopped and then fell down with a black face. It was Professor Lily, who was hanging upside down in the air, making a face at him. "When did you get here?" Dake said with a dark face. "Hey." Lily turned around and laughed. "I've been here since your class ended." Dake's heart skipped a beat. He asked, "Is there something you need from me?" "Yes." Lily rolled his eyes and said, "Professor Bacon asked me to invite you over." "Professor Bacon?" Dake couldn't help but frown. If it was Professor Bacon, could it be that there was a problem with the teaching materials? With this thought in mind, Dake voiced his doubts. Lily immediately nodded like a chick pecking at rice. Dake was slightly helpless. He could only say to Deanna and Luoc, "You guys go to the club classroom first, I'll go take a look." "Okay." Deanna and Luoc looked at each other and waved at Dake. "Yo-yos." After the two left, Dake said, "Let's go. Where are we going?" "Follow me." Lily immediately grabbed Dake's hand. A stream of magic instantly gushed out from his fingertips and enveloped Dake's whole body. Then the two's bodies blurred like phantoms and flew forward. They flew through walls. Only 2 minutes later, the two rushed into a room and came to a sudden stop. Dake tried to recall the route to the castle. He was sure that they were in a classroom dormitory. He shook his head to make the dizziness go away and opened his eyes to look around. The intellectual lady sitting behind the desk should be Professor Bacon. She was still holding a pen, and there were all kinds of papers and reference materials on the desk. But Professor Bacon wasn't the only one in the room. Several professors were sitting on the sofa and chatting. There was an old professor who looked to be at least 70 or 80 years old who was still glaring at them. Even though Dake and Lily were there, he was still spitting saliva everywhere. Dake glanced at the pot of tea on the table and suddenly thought of a word. Tea party. Then he glared at Lily, only to find that she had already floated over to the sofa. She grinned and said, Coming. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Each question is worth 100 credits. The more difficult questions are worth 1,000 credits. The teaching materials are authorized for 10,000 credits per year. Fair and honest, no haggling. Dake's face darkened. He completely realized that he had been tricked by little Lily again. But so what if it was a tea party? It wasn't like they wouldn't turn him down. In order to alleviate the awkwardness of standing in the center, he walked towards the desk. Professor Bacon stopped writing and looked up at Dake. She said, Dake Dimming? Or Anonymous? Dake paused for a moment and smiled. Of course it's Dake Dimming. Professor Bacon was puzzled. Then who is anonymous? Dark said, a mathematician who hides his identity. Mathematics, the study of numbers. What a good name. Professor Bacon sighed and waved at Dake. Dake naturally walked over. He walked around the desk and stood in front of Professor Bacon. Professor Bacon looked like she was in her 40s. She didn't have any foreign features. Her hair was a normal color, and her eyes were dark brown. Her skin was very white because she didn't leave the house, but there were some wrinkles on her forehead. She looked a little tired and there were dark circles under her eyes. When she saw Dake walk over, she turned to face him and raised both of her hands. Dake hesitated for a moment, but he still raised his hand and placed it on her hand. In fact, Dake's age in both of his lives was younger than Professor Bacon's, let alone his mental age. It wasn't awkward to be held by an elder like this. However, Professor Bacon was considered very young among the mathematics professors in Shengmalian Academy. Li, who looked younger, was actually not younger than her. Professor Bacon held his hand and after a while, she suddenly squinted and said, "What a good kid." Dake took his hand back and asked, "Professor Bacon, Professor Li said that you encountered some problems when compiling the textbook. What are the details?" Professor Bacon was stunned for a moment. She blinked and said, "Oh right, look here. Which cover do you think is the best for mathematics too?" Dake. Ju. After Dake seriously helped Professor Bacon choose the cover, Professor Bacon summoned a magic elf and ordered it to send the entire textbook over to be photocopied. She then turned to Dake and said, "Oh right, the cost of the textbook this time is 50,000, right? Wait a second." She opened the drawer and took out her school card. Dake's eyes twitched. He finally remembered that he still had 50,000 credits that had not been transferred to his account. He immediately took out his school card. Professor Bacon overlapped his school card and gently swiped it. A beep sound came from Dake's school card. It was a notification that his account had been transferred to his account. With this, his credits broke through the 100,000 mark for the first time. This degree of wealth, even among the upper grades, was quite shocking. Dake looked at the number displayed on the card and suddenly felt that it was great to be tricked by Li. His mood instantly became better because of this. Therefore, when Li pulled him to meet the other professors, his face was full of smiles. There were a total of 6 arithmetic professors in St. Marian College, as well as 2 full-time arithmetic elective professors. Now there were 6 of them. Other than Li and Professor Bacon, the other 4 were sitting on the sofa. Among them, the 70 or 80-year-old professor was named Lars Murnau. He was a professor who had just transferred from the 6th grade to the 1st grade. He was a professor who had started working at the academy during the war, and had already trained 9 batches of students. This year, he had just finished teaching 1 batch and immediately took over the position of the 1st grade. However, his body could not keep up, and he had been using medicine to nurse himself back to health. Principal Erdii originally wanted him to retire, but he felt that he could still teach 1 more batch. He spent the rest of his life like this. He watched the students he taught walk into various positions. Whether it was on the battlefield to fight for mankind, or walking into the business world to become rich, he felt sincerely happy. He had entrusted most of his life to the education industry, and wanted to welcome the end of it. This year's 1st grade students was his last batch, and he hoped that it would be the most perfect batch. "Hello, I'm Lars Murnau. Although I'm a bit early, can I get a year of authorization for mathematics I?" Professor Murnau suddenly shut up and suddenly asked a question, which made Dake slightly surprised. However, Dake then said, "No problem. The development of mathematics needs to be passed down. Even if it's provided to the 1st grade students for free, there is no problem at all." "How can that be?" Professor Murnau immediately glared and said, "Knowledge is valuable. Let's do as Li said, 10,000 a year?" Dake smiled and nodded. No. Then, beep, another 10,000 was received. The remaining 3 professors looked at each other. One of the professors, who looked like he was in his 50s, suddenly said, "I don't need the 1st grade materials. Can you give me a year of authorization for the 2nd grade materials?" "You are?" Dake asked curiously. The professor then explained himself. Ricky Eric, 3rd grade math professor. Dake thought for a bit and said, I have no problem with it, but the Mathematics 2 materials belong to the 2nd grade. Professor Eric smiled and said, No problem, I'll buy it after you buy the 3rd grade materials. As he said that, he took out his campus card and transferred 10,000 academic credits to Dake. Beep! Dake's mood became better when he heard the crisp sound of the credits being transferred. He could not help but look at the remaining 2 professors. One of the professors smiled and said, I'm a 5th grade professor. The mathematics knowledge of 5th grade professors is already set, so I won't burden the students. However, Professor Yorks wants to teach related content in the elective class. Professor Yorks was around 40 years old. He had a distinctive bald spot on his head that was very shiny. He took the opportunity and said, I want both. Can you give me a 50% discount? Dake looked at Professor Murno and Professor Eric. When he saw the 2 customers nodding, he smiled and said, Of course. Another 10,000 was received. Just like that, he only made one trip today and received a total of 80,000 academic credits. It could be said that wealth fell from the sky. He could even wake up smiling in his sleep. After the money was received, Dake became more patient. He sat on the sofa at the invitation of the professors and discussed mathematics with them without any barriers. Especially when it came to the problems in Mathematics I and Mathematics 2, he explained almost everything he knew without holding back. Not long after, Professor Lee and Professor Bacon also joined in. Thus this small academic tea party began. Dake also learned a lot from the exchange. Some of the problems that troubled him when he was compiling teaching materials were also solved during the exchange. In fact, in terms of knowledge, the professors were far more knowledgeable than him. However, the focus of both sides was different. When the professors encountered some insurmountable problems, they would try to use magic as a tool to bypass some procedures and directly obtain the answer. Or when faced with a complex calculation problem, they could use the most basic calculation method to quickly list out all the calculation procedures like a computer and finally obtain the answer. They were not like Dake, who used a variety of ready-made theorems to simplify the calculation. It could be said that although they used 2 sets of ideas, they were both heading towards the same destination. However, using magic to assist calculation was the patent of a high-level mage or magus. It was not something that ordinary students could touch. Also, due to the limitation of magic, there was a limit to the amount of calculation they could do. Therefore, Dake's calculation method was obviously more efficient and more suitable for mathematics. Yes, the professors no longer used the word arithmetic in their mouths. Instead, they kept saying mathematics, as if they were children who had just learned a trending term and could not stop using it. Once one was immersed in mathematics, one would feel that time was of no use. When the professors suddenly stopped, they realized that it was already past 8:30. Although it was not late for them, the problem was that no one here had eaten dinner. The old Professor Murno also needed to rest. Then let's call it a night. Professor Bacon said reluctantly. Everyone else echoed his sentiments. Only Professor Murno said firmly, Don't worry about me, I can still do it. Then he drank a bottle of magic potion. He looked like he could do it if no one else could. Cough, cough, cough. Professor Bacon suddenly coughed 3 times and said, Melno, it's best not to show off when you shouldn't. Tell me your main purpose today. Professor Murno seemed to be in pain. His brows, which were already full of wrinkles, were tightly knitted together. His head of white hair looked like it had been through a lot. He seemed to be very reluctant to admit his age, but in the end he still turned to Dake and called, Dake Dimming. Dake felt a little strange. He did not know what Professor Murno's main purpose was. However, due to the virtue of respecting the old and loving the young, he said, I'm listening, Professor. Professor Murno's face was a little long and narrow. His eyes were small, his nose was not high, and there was a white beard on his cheeks. There was also a small strand of white beard on his chin. He did not look kind at all, but his words and actions exuded the aura of a teacher. It was easy to relax in front of him. In terms of height, he was actually quite tall. However, as he aged, his muscles atrophied and his back bent, making him look thin and small. At this moment, Professor Murnau slightly looked away. There was a rare blush on his cheeks. The other professors looked at him kindly and waited for him to say it himself. These professors, who could argue until their faces turned red, were unusually gentle at this moment. Dake sat upright and waited for Professor Murnau to speak. Finally, Professor Murnau turned his gaze back and said, "Do you have any intention of becoming my teaching assistant?" Teaching assistant, as the name suggested, was a teacher who assisted the professor in teaching. Usually they would take on the responsibility of grading homework. Dake was very surprised by Professor Murnau's invitation. However, Professor Murnau's attitude was very serious. He maintained his calm appearance and began to think in his heart. In fact, he did not want to waste time on a teaching assistant position. He had just been promoted to the second year. There were more things he wanted to do than mountains. If he became Professor Murnau's teaching assistant, not only would he have to spend extra time grading homework, but he would also be distracted. He could not be like Panduola, who was a librarian and had to take care of so many things at the same time. The room was very quiet. The professor seemed to be waiting for the two people to make a decision. Professor Murnau was famous for being stubborn. He needed to be more determined than the average person to make a decision like this. However, his body could not tolerate his stubbornness anymore. In order to fulfill his wish of teaching the last batch of students, he needed an assistant who could help relieve his pressure. It would be best if it was someone who could take over his classes. Professor Murnau saw Dake's concern and slowly said, "It won't take up any more of your time. Grading homework, setting exam questions, and other work related to the learning of the students will all be done by me. But I need someone to help me share one of the two classes every week. The time is the first class on Tuesday morning." First class on Tuesday morning? Dake frowned and roughly understood what Professor Murnau meant. Because in the second year's class schedule, the first class on Tuesday morning was also mathematics class. When he realized this, he could not help but look at Professor Li. Li immediately opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. He pouted and made a whistling gesture. The first year's class schedule overlapped with the second year's class schedule on Tuesday. This was clearly planned for a long time. The professor's intentions were very clear. Since Dake was the one who wrote the textbooks, there was no need for him to waste time on mathematics. So, what if he used his time to help Professor Murnau reduce his burden? This was the best of both worlds. There was nothing he could not agree to. Dake thought it through and said, "If it's just Tuesday morning, no problem." Phew. Little Lily sighed in relief. Professor Murnau was still embarrassed as he said, "Then I'll leave the first year to you. As for your assistant's salary, it will be 1/5 of the professor's salary." Salary? Dark paused for a moment and asked, "How much?" Professor Murnau smiled and said, 2,000 academic credits. But you won't have any paid holidays or end-of-term bonuses. Dake said, "Of course. 1 class per week, for classes per month. If you were to earn 2,000 credits, that would be 500 credits per class." This was no longer something that could be explained by earning money. However, the professor's salary was less than he expected. It was likely that the end-of-semester bonuses were the biggest. Also, the professors seemed to be able to apply for research funding from the school. That was the real benefit. Of course, the exact salary did not matter. Dake was just using his time to earn some extra money. I wonder how Victoria and Phoenix will react when they see me enter the classroom? He could not help but smile. After reaching a consensus, Dake and Professor Murnau signed a contract with relaxed conditions. After the first-year mathematics class was adjusted, there were only 2 classes a week. Each class was held in a large lecture hall and was taught by all 4 departments. The main purpose of this was to reduce Professor Murnau's workload. Of course, with the addition of an assistant, the workload would be reduced. After Dake signed the contract, he discussed some of the teaching details with Professor Murnau. He was already very experienced in this area. After a few sentences, Professor Murnau realized that he had found the right person. On the other hand, Professor Lilly, who had secretly arranged this matter, had been snickering on the side. 9:30 am. Dake and Professor Murnau finished their conversation. Dake then got up and said, "I'll go back first. Professor Murno said gently, "Remember that I will be waiting for you in the classroom at 8 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning." Dake smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm not late." Professor Murno shook his hand again and said, "Then I'll leave it to you." Dake shook his hand and said, "See you tomorrow, Professor." Then he turned around and prepared to leave through the front door. But Lily grabbed his hand, and with a bayou sound, she took him through the wall again and sped away. After only 2 minutes, they arrived at the cafeteria. At 9:30 p.m., there were only a few customers in the cafeteria. The halfling chefs were talking about the latest popular topics, and were not surprised by Lily's sudden appearance. Let's eat, it's my treat," Lily said casually and pulled Dake to the window. As they got closer, Dake heard the halfling auntie at the window talking about the new shops in Traveler Street. One of them was National Duel Club, Academy Branch. Because the card production was still in the final stage, the National Duel Club mainly sold photocopies. It was very popular when it was launched 2 days ago. Unfortunately, the production of photocopies was limited, and could only be provided daily. Even though the students did not understand the relationship between National Duel Club and photocopies, they all remembered this new shop. Of course, this also had a lot to do with the cute twin shop owners. When the Magical Animals Society produced special products, Dake would add a special shelf for the Magical Animals Society in the branch, and put the products there for sale. This was a steady source of credits. Dake was in a good mood, and did not care about Lily's shouting treat in the free cafeteria. "Is there anything else you're hiding from me?" After the two sat down, Dake said casually while putting food into Lily's bowl. No. Lily replied without even blinking her eyes as she happily ate her favorite delicacies. Dark let out a sigh and started eating as well. Seeing how Lily earned so many credits for him, he decided to let her go this time. After dinner, the two did not stay and directly separated on the path outside the cafeteria. Dake turned around and ran towards the spiral clock tower. Fortunately, he just caught up with the club members coming down from the top of the clock tower. Not only Deanna and the other 3, but there were also 11 magic elves jumping behind them. The feathered serpent golem on the tower of the aristocrat house was already used to the magic elves coming in and out, so it did not stop them. "Good evening, everyone." Dake awkwardly and politely greeted the club members. "Hello, President." Katarina took the lead, and the 4 girls said in unison. The magic guide fairies were a bit slower, and they all started meowing. The little demonic beast flew to Dark's shoulder with a crash. The rest of the magic elves also surrounded them. Deanna asked, President, where did Professor Lily take you?" Dake smiled and said, "A simple academic tea party." Deanna did not understand and said, Oh. Katarina and Brittany were a bit surprised. Katarina subconsciously asked, "Which subject is the academic tea party?" Dark, math. It's for arithmetic. 5 and 1 10,000 plus, 181/233. Good morning, brother. The diligent baby is asking for monthly votes again. Chapter 555. An academic tea party for arithmetic class? Katrina covered her mouth, her face full of disbelief. She might be able to join in on subjects like potioneering or history of magic. But when it came to arithmetic, one could either know it or not. How was she supposed to hold an academic tea party with knowledgeable professors? Katrina's grades weren't the best, but she was confident in her reading ability. She felt that what Dake said was unbelievable. But when she turned to look at the others, she found that Deanna and Luosi didn't seem surprised at all. It seemed that Dake Diming's arithmetic class had reached that level. Katarina fell silent. Brittany Christian didn't have as clear a sense as Katrina, but she didn't think much of it either. The group returned to the castle in a strange atmosphere, then walked back to their dorms at the fork in the road. Website: https://mvipcanchu. VIP. But after taking a few steps, Katrina suddenly stopped. She was born in Signs, which was known as the capital of knowledge. She grew up in an environment with a strong academic atmosphere. She had heard about all kinds of people who were born with knowledge, but this was the first time she saw one with her own eyes. Is this the Valkyrie's son who won the Easter Duel Festival 2 years in a row? No, maybe it's just an academic tea party in name, but it's actually a meeting for the professors to guide the students? Katrina tried her best to convince herself. But Dake noticed that her footsteps had stopped, so he turned around and asked curiously, "What's wrong, Katrina?" Katrina had no choice but to turn around and respond. She couldn't help but ask, "President, does your academic tea party have a theme?" "A theme?" Dake thought for a while and said, "Well, there is one. You can say it's mathematics." Katrina asked curiously, "Mathematics?" Dake smiled and nodded. "Yes, mathematics. If it's the 3rd grade, Professor Eric should be preparing soon. Maybe you'll start your math class next class." Katrina was even more confused. "Mathematics class?" Dake explained. "It's another name for arithmetic class." In short, he would know when the time came. "Good night, senior sister." *I/Omega/. Dake waved his hand and left for real this time. Katerina also turned around and walked towards the Sorcerer's Institute, but as she walked, she suddenly turned around and walked towards the library. Even though the 2nd class tomorrow morning was math, she still couldn't help but want to go to the library to find out what math was. On Dake's side, Luoxi's curiosity was piqued. He whispered, "Is it about the textbook?" Dake nodded. "Yes. Our math textbook for this year has already been compiled, and the first math lesson should be handed out tomorrow morning. But I'm not going to math class tomorrow." Deanna was humming a song as she walked forward. When she heard the message, she suddenly stopped and pricked up her ears. "Eh?" Dake couldn't help but laugh. "That's not right. I probably won't even go to math class this year. That's why Deanna has to take notes seriously in class. Otherwise, if you don't even know what you don't know, how can I explain it to you?" Diana immediately pouted and said coquettishly, "Why must I not know how to do it? Can it be that Diana has mastered everything after taking notes seriously?" Luoxi hugged Deanna from the side and scratched her armpits. Deanna's fantasy was shattered, and she giggled. The moonlight tonight was beautiful as usual. The moonlight shone through the windows of the castle, and the shadows of the 3 people were extremely long. They gradually overlapped. Deanna and Luoxi were surprised when they heard that Dake was going to be a first-year teaching assistant. They originally thought that Dake just didn't have to go to class. After all, he was the editor of the teaching materials. They didn't expect that he would bring them an even bigger surprise. While they were still worried about the difficulty of the subject, Dake Dimming had already become a professor. The first-year students should be surprised, right? The 2 girls went into the dormitory playfully. Dake also went into the room with the magic elves. He picked up the kitty plant that rushed up to welcome him, turned on the light, and sat by the bed for a moment. Then he took out today's great sins. While there was still some time, he took out his mathematics eye and started to prepare for tomorrow's class. Although he had a lot of money now, the fixed monthly salary of 2,000 credits was still very considerable. If the 2,000 credits were converted into holy coins, it would be 32,000 holy coins a month. Even in the king's city, it was considered a high salary. Moreover, he only had to attend 4 classes a month, and the working time was only 6 hours. Yes, 6 hours. After careful calculation, he found that he had already gained a huge advantage. What a professor needed to do was not just to teach. However, even if he didn't have this salary, he didn't mind taking on this job as an assistant. Knock, knock, knock. Just as Dake was immersed in his thoughts, there was a light knock on the dormitory door. Without needing his instructions, the little devil beast had already flown to open the door. The person who appeared at the door was indeed Aurora. Dake put down his pen and quietly closed the textbook. He was going to give Aurora a surprise tomorrow. Aurora tied her silver-white hair behind her head and put on a chef's hat. She was still wrapped in an apron that she had not taken off. Dake looked at the plate in front of her chest, took a light breath and said, "Little Aurora, it's already very late. I don't want to affect your rest because of this." Aurora's face was slightly red. She shook her head and said, "No, it won't. I will get enough sleep every day. And today, I installed a simple kitchen and a smoking and fireproof device on the balcony. In the future, I don't need to go to the kitchen, and can study recipes in the room. Look, this is the bun you told me about. As she said that, she opened the round cover on the plate. The rich smell of the meat bun, as if it was engraved in the bone marrow, slowly drifted out from the gap of the cover. Then, as the cover was completely opened, the room was suddenly filled with the smell of the meat bun. The magical spirits that had already climbed onto the small bed suddenly poked their heads out from under the blankets. Their small noses kept twitching. The little devil beast's mouth suddenly drew an arc. Little Snorlax, who was too lazy to move, decided to settle down in the club dormitory in the end. Didn't know what it had missed out on. I'm going to die from laughter. What a joke. Dake couldn't help but feel hungry. He thought that gluttony would erupt one day, but his body couldn't help but move on its own. Aurora's culinary skills were really good. She was already comparable to Olga, and could be compared to the halfling chefs. What she lacked was only recipes and experience. Her skill level was far beyond that of a dabbler like Dake. For example, the meat bun tonight. Dake had only mentioned it briefly. Not only did she copy it, she even made a steamer for herself. How much time did you spend researching the meat bun? Dake couldn't help but ask. Aurora lowered her head slightly and whispered, not much. Just the weekend and 2 days. No wonder she didn't come last night. Dake took a deep breath as he looked at the meat bun. The gluttony in his heart couldn't help but crawl out. Let me try. As he said that, he picked up the silver fork on the plate and inserted it into the meat bun. Aurora's culinary skills were amazing. The meat bun's skin was thin and didn't break. When the fork was inserted, a thick gravy flowed out from the gaps. The smell of the meat became even more intense. Dake used his other hand to cushion the bottom. He carefully forked the first bun and put it into his mouth. Then he gently bit into it. The gravy flowed into his mouth from the torn skin. The temperature was just right, and it wasn't too hot. The gravy was slightly salty, but it was just right for Dake's taste. He couldn't help but bite off a piece of meat wrapped around the bun's skin. Then he hurriedly chewed it carefully. The incomparably familiar and wonderful taste instantly spread out, leaving a rich aftertaste. When the entire meat bun was in his stomach, gluttony +1 slowly floated in front of Dake's eyes. When he saw the sinful index that only he could see, he couldn't help but think, why don't I just make gluttony my next research target? Aurora actually brought quite a number of meat buns, but with so many magic elves, even if they only had one each, it would still be a steamer. Thus, it didn't take long for the meat buns to be completely eaten. Aurora looked at the empty steamer, but her heart was filled with satisfaction. She felt as if she had found the meaning of being in the academy. Today's meat buns are very delicious. Dake looked at her seriously, and used the most ordinary words to express his current feelings. Then I'll make more tomorrow night, Aurora said forcefully. Dake hurriedly said, Don't, you've just entered the academy. Your studies are more important. Aurora smiled faintly and said, The knowledge in those textbooks is very simple. I'll be able to understand it after taking a look. Dake blinked and could only say, But the contents in the textbooks are only the most basic. If you want to truly achieve something, you have to learn how to study deeply and do research on your own. The Shungmalian Academy's library is a place where you can find almost all of the existing books. Senior Panduola is the librarian of the library. Aurora nodded and said, I've already been to the library and greeted Senior Panduola. When I'm not studying culinary arts, I'll also read and study. Don't worry about me. Also, I successfully refined a magical fantasy beast yesterday. Do you want to take a look? Magical fantasy beast? Dake was slightly startled and asked doubtfully, Shouldn't the first-year student's first magic elf be refined at the beginning of next month? Aurora lowered her eyelids and said, The introduction to magic professor gave each of us a bag of magical fantasy beast materials after the second class. Dake. 1 bag per person? Aurora hurriedly shook her head and said, That's not it. I think it's just Anna, and Chi, John, Joey, Vivian. There are about 10 of them in total. Dake took a deep breath and said, This is preferential treatment. Aurora thought for a moment and said, That should be it. According to the professor, the few of us have a solid enough foundation, and can refine magical fantasy beasts in advance. Dake asked, What about Victoria and Phoenix? Aurora shook her head and said, they haven't. That's true. Dake nodded and said, although Victoria and Phoenix have come into contact with magic knowledge, they only officially started learning after entering the academy. Also, as magic elves, their control of magic power still needs to be trained. Can you summon your magical fantasy beast for me to see? Aurora understood what he meant and immediately took out the magic elven card from her carry-on card bag. Dake said slowly, the magical fantasy beast is your first magic elf other than your familiar. It may not be strong, but it's the embodiment of a Magus's personal characteristics and is very important to a Magus. I've already given your familiar a certain degree of intelligence. This magical fantasy beast is the second and temporarily the last. You have to understand. Aurora nodded obediently and then blushed as she used the usual summoning spell. Although the speed wasn't fast, she still successfully summoned the magical fantasy beast in her hand. The fantasy beast that appeared above the summoning array was a round mirror that floated in the air. This kind of magic guide fairy was actually quite rare. Dake was a little surprised and couldn't help but observe it carefully. Aurora's round mirror had two sides. The front side was like the sun emitting blazing flames, and the back side was like the full moon emitting cold moonlight. Different frames and different attributes caused the two mirrors to be completely different. The front side was a mirror made of copper, and the back side was a silver-white mercury mirror. From the feeling, it didn't have the dual attributes of fire and ice on the surface, but the even rarer dual attributes of light and darkness. Dake suppressed the urge to ask about its attributes and surekill skills inside. Your magical fantasy beast is quite strange. Aurora reached out and grabbed the handle of the mirror, blushing as she said, my magical fantasy beast is called the Glorious Sun-Moon Mirror. The front side can absorb sunlight, and the back side can absorb moonlight. But for some reason, it doesn't have a surekill skill. It's just a white card. Just a white card? Dake frowned slightly and said, maybe it's just that you haven't found the right way to use it. I'll help you activate your intelligence first. Aurora said excitedly, okay. Dake took out Pride Eye again and activated it, shining it at the Glorious Sun-Moon Mirror. Even if a magic elf was to activate its intelligence, its thinking would be less active than the average person. Just like Dake's scabbard, it could float in the air without thinking. But as for the specifics, Aurora had to develop it herself. After the Glorious Sun-Moon Mirror's intelligence was activated, it didn't show much. But when Aurora whispered to it, it had an exact response. Dake looked at the mirror and suddenly had an idea. He immediately wrote a line of words and showed it, saying, little Aurora, look at the mirror and read this. Aurora was puzzled, but she still read it word by word. Magic mirror, who is the most beautiful woman in the world? After saying this sentence, Aurora's cheeks instantly flushed red like fire. Dark immediately looked at the surface of the brilliant sun-moon mirror. But the magical fairy didn't give him any face at all. There was no movement on either side of the mirror at all. He clicked his tongue. The experiment was a failure. That's not right, at least I got a red apple. When Aurora took the cutlery and left, she suddenly felt like she was being teased. But she quickly convinced herself. Dake isn't that kind of person. However, the speed at which she moved her feet increased. Dake returned to his desk and sat down. He spun his pen and thought for a moment, but he couldn't think of how to use the mirror with a very interesting name. He had no choice but to temporarily put this problem aside and continue to prepare for class. When he was ready, it was already past midnight. The fragrance of the healing flower became very faint after it drifted away, and it was basically impossible to smell. But its effect continued to be exerted, and there was a faint sense of comfort when bathed in the fragrance of the flower. In order to be energetic when he woke up early in the morning, Dake practiced the underworld spirit spell for 15 minutes before he went to sleep. At 6 o'clock sharp on Tuesday morning, Dake Deming was awakened by his biological clock. He continued to sleep for a while and got up before Sloth +1. Then he began to take care of his hair and appearance. Since it was his first time substituting for the first year, he had to leave a good impression on the first-year students. Even if the identities of Victoria and Phoenix were exposed later, as long as his image was high enough, it would make it easier for the first-year students to accept their identities. These were the additional effects that a good impression could bring. After spending half an hour carefully taking care of himself, Dake looked at himself in the mirror without any flaws. He nodded slightly and walked out of the bathroom. Then, he elegantly finished the breakfast brought by the little monster, wiped the corners of his mouth, and read the newspaper as usual. A week after school started, the reports about the Shungmalian Academy in the newspaper had decreased to almost nothing, but the Holy Judgment operation of the saint was exposed. Whether it was the Great Sage Daily or the Clown Daily, they published the news of the Holy Judgment operation on a large scale. Although the ultimate goal of the Holy Judgment operation was difficult to achieve, it had to be said that its effect was gradually showing. Evil organizations and remnants of the demon clan were continuously captured or killed on the spot. The news of some notorious criminals being punished by the Holy Church was also widely publicized in the newspapers. The prestige of the saint increased after the immortal demon king was executed, and during the Holy Judgment operation, it further increased. It was not known if it was because of the benefits, but the saint showed obvious signs of self-promotion. Dake didn't care much about the situation of the saint. He just habitually glanced at it, and then there was no then. After he finished reading the newspaper, he once again reviewed the content that he was going to talk about in class, and then put the things that he needed into his shoulder bag. Finally, he thought about it and stuffed a magic pen into it. Professors usually held a magic wand when they were teaching. It could be used to assist in casting spells, and it could also be used as a substitute for a pointer. Dake didn't have such a thing, so he simply used a magic pen as a substitute. At 7:30, everything was ready. He tightened his collar and pushed the door open. After he left, the magic elves in the dormitory got up and took care of themselves. Then they would wait until the 8 o'clock bell rang, before going to the cafeteria to eat. After that, most of them would go to the club classroom, and a few of them would go to the library. In short, wherever the fragrance of the flowers reached, it was their range of activity. The students and professors in the castle would occasionally see these magic elves, and would give them a curious look. Fortunately, they were cute and well-behaved, so it was hard to leave a bad impression. If this continued for a long time, most people would passively get used to their existence. It was just that the first-year students who had just started learning magic theory would have a hard time understanding how these magic elves could be so smart. Dake walked out of the tower, and under the confused gazes of the second-year students, he gradually walked away from them. It should be here. Dake lowered his head and looked at the map displayed on his school card. After confirming that he was not in the wrong place, he couldn't help but quicken his pace. Not long after, there were some small voices in front of him. The first-year mathematics classroom was in front of him. Found it. Dake instantly slowed down his pace and calmed himself down. He had more than one experience as a substitute teacher, so he wouldn't be flustered by this kind of thing. But after all, this was his first time working as a first-year student. In addition to teaching, he also needed to remember the names of all the students during the roll call. In this aspect, no matter which professor it was, they all seemed to do a good job. But he didn't have much confidence. But rats had their ways, and snakes had their ways. He also had his own methods. In front of the classroom, Dake lightly raised his left hand, and a thick black grimoire appeared in his palm. Then he raised his head and puffed out his chest, and pushed open the classroom door. The lecture hall that could accommodate all the first-year students was very spacious. Just as Dake was familiar with, the entire classroom was divided into 4 areas according to the school. Each school's students sat in their own area. The first-year mathematics professor, Lars Murnau, was sitting in the corner of the podium near the window, and he didn't hide his observation of the students below the podium. And the students, under the gaze of the old professor, only dared to whisper, quietly guessing Professor Murnau's intentions. Not far from Professor Murnau, 2 little princesses were sitting in the first row of the noble house area, and they were having a heated discussion. Anna and Anchi had an argument over seats on the first day of school. Neither of them wanted to sit with each other, but they both wanted to sit in the first row. In the end, they squeezed in the first row and stared at each other, and the seats in the back were all taken. When they came back to their senses, the seats were already nailed down, and they could only grit their teeth and sit down. After leaving the eyes of the first princess and the second princess, Anna and Anchi became more and more unscrupulous. Even the professors had a headache because of them. And in the second row behind them sat Joey and Aurora. These two could be said to be the second in line of the first-year noble house. While the two little princesses were staring at each other, Aurora was reading mathematics very seriously. Joey, who was next to her, was also affected and was flipping through the book. Next to the noble house was the night house. Phoenix's seat was relatively at the back. She was taller among the first years, so she chose to sit in the back row. At this moment, she tilted her head slightly and looked out of the window. No one knew what she was thinking. And in the last row of the night house area, sat the tallest student among the first years, Spike Leon. This orc royal sat alone at the back, reading a book with his bell-sized eyes. On the other side, John Dimming of the magic school sat in the middle, carefully flipping through the textbook. As for the dark elf Vivian Alvind, she sat in the front row without minding the stares of others. She was very serious even though she was alone. Only Victoria Dimming of the House of Fools was absent-minded from the beginning. The books on the table were neatly placed, and it was obvious that they had not been touched since they were taken out. It was not until Dake kept approaching that she showed a puzzled expression. Creak! The classroom door was suddenly pushed open, and a handsome blonde youth walked into the classroom with a grimoire in his hand and a sling bag on his shoulder. The atmosphere in the classroom froze for a moment, and the discussion that had been deliberately suppressed came to an abrupt end. Dark swept his gaze around and quickly found the few people he knew below the stage. He walked to the podium without a change in expression, and his gaze fell on Professor Murnau's face. This was his first class as an assistant, and Professor Murnau would sit in on the entire class. On one hand, it was to observe Dake's teaching standards, and on the other hand, it was to support Dake. This was because there were a few troublemakers among the first years this year, and even he felt a headache coming on. Dake gestured slightly to Professor Murnau and walked to the podium. He took off his sling bag and placed it on the table, then took out his textbook, roll book, magic pen, and looked up at the audience. During this process, the first-year magisters went from confusion to shock. Their originally suppressed voices involuntarily increased in volume. Quite a few gazes were focused on Professor Murnau, who was sitting there calm and unruffled. Victoria's little mouth formed an O shape. She didn't even react when her deskmate kept poking her arm. She probably didn't expect that her master would suddenly walk in like a professor. Chown, who was immersed in his book, didn't notice anything at first. It wasn't until the atmosphere around him was obviously not right that he raised his head. Then, his handsome face suddenly turned pale, and the pen in his hand fell on the table with a clatter. Joey was even worse than Chown, and he immediately hugged his head and wanted to run away. Aurora, who was seriously reading her book, quickly came to her senses after the initial shock. Then, she saw the little princess in the front row asking Professor Murnau a question. However, Professor Murnau only had a calm look on his face as he smiled and gently stroked his white beard. Clap, clap, clap. Dake Dimming skillfully clapped his hands to attract the attention of the students, causing the noisy classroom to gradually quiet down. The students all looked up at him, waiting for him to introduce himself and explain the reason. Just then Dake spoke with assurance. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure most of you have seen me at the entrance banquet. Some of you will have a deeper impression of me, but some of you might not remember me very well. So I'll introduce myself again. I'm Dake Dimming, and I've just become Professor Murnau's teaching assistant. From now on, I'll be the substitute for the first math class every week. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand and ask. As soon as he finished speaking, a girl from the magic department raised her hand. Dake raised his magic pen and pointed at her. The girl stood up and said, "Excuse me, aren't you a second-year senior? Why did you become Professor Murnau's teaching assistant? Or rather, why?" The last sentence, "why?" completely highlighted the girl's aura. Her eyes were cold, her lips were thin, and her tone of voice was unconsciously raised. From the reactions of the students around her, She seemed to have a strong sense of community. In the magic department, where knowledge was paramount, she was definitely an outstanding student. Dake smiled and said, "That's a problem. Look at the last page of Mathematics I in your hand, it will tell you the answer." Cecilia Doyle looked at the last page of Mathematics I with a puzzled expression. Then she looked from the top of the page until she saw the name, Dake Dimong. Her expression tensed up, and she suddenly looked up. Dake smiled at her and asked, "Do you have any more questions?" "No." Cecilia took a deep breath and sat down. The students in the classroom flipped open their textbooks at the same time. A strange atmosphere spread out like ripples in water. The sound of the students instantly made it clear that they were not calm. Someone even raised his hand and said, "Senior Dimong, is the name written on the book really yours?" Dake turned around and wrote his name on the textbook and said, "Write it down. We will be together for at least a semester. I believe you will need to remember my name. Then, if there are no other questions, let's start the roll call." No matter how stubborn they were, they would not be able to stand up at this time. Not to mention that the most stubborn first-year students were very familiar with Dake. The two little princesses puffed up their cheeks like pufferfish. For the first time since school started, they gathered together to discuss. Chown and Joey were frightened by the fear that was rooted deep in their hearts. The shadows of their childhood kept appearing one after another. Victoria and Phoenix did not know what was going on, but of course they did not dare to say anything. At this time, no matter what, the most important thing was to pretend to be obedient. Aurora, on the other hand, was in high spirits. She enjoyed the surprise brought by Dake very much. The dark elf girl looked around and the royal orc frowned deeply. Anyway, the roll call began. The name was compared to the students' appearance one by one. The sorcerer's secretary recorded all of this. Dake did not need to deliberately memorize the name as it could show the name. After the roll call ended, Dake officially started the class. Because it was a formal class and not a substitute class like before, Dake directly asked the first-year students to open their textbooks and continue the class based on what they learned last week. The beginning of Mathematics I was all about basic calculations. It was nothing more than teaching how to use the vertical form and reciting the multiplication table. In addition, it was about the priority of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and so on. The class itself was not difficult. After all, it was only the third class of the semester. After that, it would gradually become more difficult. Dake Dimong had a lot of teaching experience. Even Deanna could master it under his guidance, not to mention the first-year students. He skillfully added some mathematics stories in the class, which gradually livened up the originally silent atmosphere. After a part of the content was finished, Dake quickly wrote a few questions on the blackboard. Then he directly called out a few people who were absent-minded in class, and moved on to the practice section. Chown. Chown suddenly trembled. He subconsciously stood up and tensed his body. It was the first time the students around him had seen the smart and steady Chown like this. If it was not for Professor Dimong standing on the podium, they would have thought that Chown had seen a ghost. "Put down your books and come up to answer the questions," Dake said casually and called out Joey's name. After the younger twin was reminded by Aurora, she walked up to the podium like a zombie. Her hair bundles that were shaped like the spiral clock tower's stairs bounced up and down. It was very textured. The daughter of the Dimong family, who was usually noble and elegant, had completely lost her composure. People who did not know better would have thought that Professor Dimong on the podium did something to her. After the siblings were called out, Dake called out two more boys. Then, Victoria was lucky enough to call out her name. Next, he called out the Orc King Spike Leon. A total of 6 people were called up to the podium. They picked up chalk and started to calculate the equations on the blackboard. With Chown's ability, he should not have been troubled by this level of calculation. However, he could not stop shaking when he was beside Dake. He could not calm down at all. Joey, on the other hand, did not listen the whole time. His mind was a mess. On the other hand, Victoria bit her lip and crookedly listed out many vertical equations on the blackboard. Finally, she got the answer. As for the remaining 3 boys, other than the little orc, They all successfully solved the problem and hurriedly left the podium. Professor Murnau did not call out the students to come up to the podium to solve last week's class. However, they had only attended 2 classes, so they did not know if there was such a practice. However, they did not know that from this moment onwards, Professor Murnau had truly learned this trick. He had always relied on the completion of homework to assess the students' mastery of the content in the class. However, the interval between 2 classes was too long. The plagiarism of homework after class could not be stopped no matter how hard he tried. In fact, it was very difficult to grasp. Dake's method of asking a few students to come up to the podium to solve the questions every time he finished a small part of the lecture. The rest of the students solved the questions below the podium. Not only did this allow the students to consolidate the content they had just learned, but it also allowed them to grasp the difficulty of the lecture. At the same time, he also punished the bad students who were absent in class. Bad student Chown. Bad student Joey. Bad student Spicer. He stood on the podium as if he was being publicly executed. If Professor Halderboyd, who specialized in magical languages, was here, he would definitely stop his bad habit of hanging people in the air. After all, hanging in the air was not necessarily as torturous as it was now. Professor Halderboyd might even praise Dake Diming's teaching methods and sympathize with him. Looking at the completely frozen Chown, Joey and Spicer, Dake frowned slightly and said, "Chown, Joey, deduct 5 points each. Spicer, if you really don't understand, you can ask the students who understand after class. You can also go to the office and ask Professor Murnau. Of course, you can also come to me. As long as you ask and learn, there's no knowledge that can't be grasped." "Yes, Professor," Spicer said in a rough voice and then left the podium with a depressed expression. Joey couldn't help but mutter, "Why is he the only one who didn't get his points deducted?" Dake's gaze turned and fell on her. She couldn't help but tremble. Dake said in a kind tone, "For a mathematics class, you must have a solid foundation at the beginning. If you don't have a solid foundation, it will be very difficult to learn in the future. You guys can leave now. Be more serious in class." Joey didn't dare to refute and quickly left the podium. One of the 3 giants of the 1st grade in the noble house lost all face. Chown also left the podium with a gloomy face. He felt that he could solve the questions, it was just that he wasn't in the right state. After they left, Dake explained each question and gave extra points to those who answered it correctly. No points were deducted for those who answered wrongly. The real gain of credits made some students who just understood the value of credits restless. The enthusiasm of the students was also aroused because of this. Dake took the opportunity to ask more questions in class for answers. The students who wanted to earn credits immediately answered the questions enthusiastically. The atmosphere of the class quickly became better. Ring, ring, ring. Unknowingly, the bell had already rung. Dake put down his pen reluctantly, and then gave out the related homework. Today's class was quite enjoyable. See you guys next week. He realized that he seemed to have a good teacher side of himself. When Dake was about to leave the classroom, Professor Murnau waved at him and he slowed down. When Professor Murnau caught up, the 2 walked side by side. Professor Murnau wasn't stingy with his praises for his teaching standards. He was embarrassed. "It's not that good. I just learned from the professor." "Which professor?" Lily?" "Ha ha ha, this joke isn't cold enough." The old man and the young man exchanged their teaching experiences for a while, and then separated at the fork in the road. Dake still had classes to teach and Professor Murnau should go back to rest. After the 2 professors left, the 1st grade classroom suddenly exploded with noise. Not all the students agreed with Dake's teaching. The pride in their bones made them instinctively reject a young professor, who was only a year older than them. Immaturity would make people rash and impulsive. And John and Joey's poor performance in class would also attract criticism. Conflict and bigotry often arose under these circumstances. The 2 little princesses fanned the flames and accelerated the ferment of the matter. With the princesses as backers, the discussion on how to deal with the new professor quietly unfolded in the dark. Victoria was among them and blinked her eyes. She didn't understand why these people would belittle the magisters in front of the magic elves. The two little princesses looked around and snickered in their hearts. 5 and 1 10,000 plus, 184/233. Although it's late, it's successful on the second day of August. Asking for votes. Monthly votes reached 2,000. Continue to reach 10,000 votes today. Undersir. Chapter 556. After parting ways with Professor Melner, Dake immediately turned to the History of Magic classroom, completing the perfect transition from professor to student. Today's class was only average in his opinion, but as his first official class he had to make do. Through this class he had a general understanding of Victoria and Phoenix's class status, as well as Aurora, John, and Joey. In addition, Dark Elf Vivian was also on his radar. These 6 people were basically the ones he was more concerned about in the first years. As for the 2 little princesses, he really didn't need to worry about them. But this year's lineup of first-grade students is really ridiculous. The Academy of Nobles, the Academy of Knights, the Academy of Magic, and even the House of Fools have exceptionally outstanding people. I hope it's not a bad omen. About 10 minutes before class started, Dake quietly entered the History of Magic classroom through the back door. But White and Luoboat, who were sitting in the last row by the door, still noticed him. Remember the URL? MVIP, can't you? VIP Luoboat's eyes lit up, and he immediately asked curiously, Dake, why didn't I see you last class? Dake tilted his head and smiled. I went to math class. Luoboat subconsciously asked, wasn't it math class last time? Dake said, it was first grade math class. Luoboat mumbled, oh, first grade, wait, why are you in first grade class? But Dake had already walked to the seat by the window and sat down. He took out the History of Magic textbook, flipped to the page with the bookmark, and began to read it more casually. Starting from second grade, the History of Magic finally had a new textbook. It was said that Professor Ryan Hux had specially found someone to compile the new textbook. He had put in a lot of effort to do this job well. And with the new textbook, Professor Ryan Hux no longer randomly told stories. He began to teach the history of magic systematically, and the quality of his teaching skyrocketed. Of course, the new textbook, 50,000 Years Above and Below, was indeed very well compiled. Many of the stories in it were very lively and interesting, and people couldn't help but wonder who compiled this textbook. Unfortunately, there were no names on the teaching materials, which was a pity. He's probably a hero from the Hero Palace. While Dake was thinking about this, Deanna tried to lean her head back and asked, Dake, is your class going well? It's all right, Dake said with a smile. With Professor Melno holding the fort this time, those little rascals won't dare to cause trouble. That's good. Deanna retracted her head. Dake asked, what do you think? Did you take notes in the last class? Deanna hurriedly said, of course there is. Don't keep asking. I'm not a first-grade kid. Dake laughed. Of course, you're a second-year student. Deanna. That's right, I'm already in second grade. Phew. Luosi couldn't help but laugh. Not long after, Professor Ryan Hux entered the classroom. Not only did he have long flowing hair, but he was also wearing a suit and leather shoes. He looked very energetic. He lost a leg, an arm, and an eye in the war. With the help of Professor Kazair, he had replaced them with the latest prosthetics. Basically, no one could tell that he was different from a normal person. If you were to stand next to him when he first came to the Shung Malian Academy, no one would be able to tell that they were the same person. In today's class, we'll talk about the beginning of the history of magic. As soon as the bell rang, Professor Ryan Hux started the class with great energy. The history of magic starts from the moment human beings learned about magic, and continues to this day. As Professor Ryan Hux spoke, the students felt as if they had traveled back in time to a few eras ago. They were strolling along the corridor of history, listening to the tide rolling forward. He was always able to create an extraordinary sense of immersion, making the students feel as if they were there. Dake also learned a lot from the history of magic class. Tuesday afternoon was the time for magical beasts. As usual, Professor Nini squeezed through the narrow classroom door. She no longer applied low-quality perfume on her body, and she was able to communicate with the students more freely. After becoming an official professor, Nini was obviously more confident, and also more confident in the choice of magical beasts for teaching. The students looked at the ferocious and terrifying magical beasts on the podium, and their faces were a mixture of fear and excitement. After all, they were children born in peacetime, and they had never faced real danger. Even if they had great power because of magical beasts, they might not be able to unleash it. Besides teaching the students about the ecology, characteristics, and value of magical beasts, Professor Nini's most notable feature was that she could help the students overcome their fear of these dangerous creatures. This was the main reason why she was able to pass Professor Shi-Erfa's review and become an official professor. After receiving Professor Shi-Erfa's approval, she had to work harder and catch more terrifying and dangerous magical beasts for the students to have an early experience. After the students familiarized themselves with Professor Nini's teaching style, they were no longer as helpless as they were at the beginning. Instead, they looked forward to magical beasts and adventures in the dungeon. It was a pity that they had to pass the physical assessment before they were allowed to enter the dungeon. After the magical beasts class ended, Dake went to the library and greeted Senior Panduola. Then he went to the club's classroom and finished his homework with the club members. Katrina and Brittany finally understood what Mathematics 2 was. They looked at Dake with resentment in their eyes. Then they realized that the Year 3 and Year 2 students were doing the same mathematics homework. Of course, the problems they encountered were quite similar. After Dake finished his homework, he took the opportunity to tutor them. Katrina's ability to digest and absorb knowledge was the best, while Brittany and Deanna were much clumsier. Especially Brittany, she lacked the patience to study quietly. Dake could only hope that the strong learning atmosphere in the club would motivate her. After the homework was done, it was time for club activities. There were basically no club activities in the Magical Beasts Club. While they were gradually adding more decorations to the club's classroom, they were all happily doing their own things. Luosi and Katrina would occasionally exchange their reading experience. Deanna clumsily learned Brittany's knitting skills. Dake himself was holding the unobtainable bird egg and chanting scriptures. Since the magical beasts would gather in the club every morning, they naturally wouldn't leave the unobtainable bird egg in the dormitory. Dake held the unobtainable bird egg and tried to sense the movement inside with his mana. Recently, he felt that the egg was about to hatch. The movement inside the egg was like a baby kicking its mother's belly after 10 months of pregnancy. It made him feel very close to it. The unobtainable bird egg absorbed human aura to hatch. After hatching, its appearance, characteristics, and personality would more or less be affected by the human aura. If the human aura it absorbed was pure enough, it would recognize the human as its parent after it was born. Basically, it was a type of mystical animal. Therefore, after Dake obtained the unobtainable bird egg, he didn't let anyone other than Professor Lily come into contact with it. He was very much looking forward to the unobtainable bird egg hatching. It would give him a feeling very similar to refining a magical beasts, but a little different. Today, he had a very strong feeling that the unobtainable bird egg was about to hatch. The closer it got to night, the stronger this feeling became. It was to the point that the book in his hand didn't smell good anymore. He nestled in the club president's office, holding the unobtainable bird egg, and waiting impatiently. However, until 9 p.m., the club members all noticed that something was wrong with the club president. When they peeked at the door, the unobtainable bird egg still showed no signs of hatching. Kakik. Dake was a little startled when a head suddenly popped out from the ceiling. He looked up with a dark expression at Li, who had an evil smile on his face, and complained, "Can't I just enter from the front door? Wouldn't that be very uncharacteristic of a little fairy?" After Lily popped out from the ceiling, she flipped in the air 3.5 times before lying on top of the unobtainable bird egg. As the club instructor of the Magical Animals Club, it wasn't surprising for her to appear in the club's classroom at any time. However, this time around, it was Dark who summoned her with his society card. Since the unobtainable bird egg was about to hatch, Lily Laplace obviously couldn't not be present. She put her ear to the eggshell and listened carefully, then said excitedly, "It's really coming out." "Really? I think so too." Dake thought for a bit, then took out a children's book from the bookshelf behind him, wondering if he should read it. "What are you doing?" Lily asked curiously. Dake said, "Prenatal education, Lily." Therefore, before the unobtainable bird egg hatched, Dake told it a story about a tadpole looking for its mother, so that it could instill the concept of children should not lose their parents in it, trying to change its bad habit of secretly raising other chicks before it was born. However, just as he was halfway through, the unobtainable bird egg suddenly shook. Dake immediately stopped and looked at the egg with all his attention. "Come." Lily's expression instantly became serious. She reached out and grabbed Dake's hands, then guided them to the egg. Both of their hands were tightly pressed against the sides of the eggshell, carefully feeling the movements of the chicks. Once, twice. It moved more and more frequently. Bang! The egg suddenly jumped, and extremely thin cracks appeared on the top of the eggshell. Then, the cracks suddenly shattered like a dense spider web. A small round head broke through the eggshell and suddenly popped out. It didn't look like a normal newborn chick that couldn't even open its eyes. Its big round eyes were full of intelligence. It first glanced at Dake, then turned to look at Lily, then turned to look at Dake, then turned to look at Lily. It seemed to be a little dizzy, and with a squish, it sat back down in the eggshell. "Chirp, why do I feel like this girl isn't very smart?" Dake couldn't help but reach out and carefully poke the unobtainable bird's head. Perhaps because it was the product of the projection, this unobtainable bird was slightly different from what was recorded. Not only did it grow feathers as soon as it was born, but it also didn't have a neck. It looked like two balls stacked on top of each other, so round that it made people want to rub its feathers bald. However, considering that it was a newborn, Dake didn't do it. Bang! The door to the office was suddenly broken open, and the members of the club and the magic elves that were squeezed together fell to the ground with a crash. Then, they stood up as if nothing had happened, and pretended to be surprised. Wow, the egg hatched. It was so fake that it made people's hearts ache. Ho ho, the unobtainable beast crawled out of the crowd and ran to the desk in 3 steps. It stood on its tiptoes and clung to the edge of the desk with its claws. It stared at the unobtainable bird baby with a hint of excitement in its heart. Ever since it was summoned, the unobtainable beast didn't have a strong sense of existence. It spent most of its time in the club's classroom, and only occasionally went to the cafeteria with the magic elves to eat. However, after leaving the club's classroom, it would feel uneasy. It was as if once it left, the club's classroom would become an empty room that could be broken in and stolen at any time. The responsibility of guarding the club's classroom was like an engraving, deeply imprinted in the depths of its heart from the moment it was born. This was actually a basic circuit that was rooted in the body of the club's spirit. Now that the club's first magical animal had successfully hatched, it was like having a family member that shared the same bloodline. The feeling was naturally different. It carefully observed the black and white ball in the eggshell, and all kinds of images of its interactions with it had already appeared in its mind. After the dizzy unobtainable bird regained consciousness, it happened to meet the unobtainable beast's gaze. It seemed to find the unobtainable beast's appearance very interesting, so it raised its wings and chirped at the unobtainable beast. When Dake saw this, he reached out and picked up the unobtainable beast from the side of the table, then placed it on the table. The unobtainable beast carefully moved forward, squatted down, stretched out its claws, and touched the unobtainable bird's fingertips. After a gentle touch, the unobtainable bird suddenly raised its head and laughed. Then with a smack sound, it slid back and lay down along the curve of the eggshell, blinking its big eyes at the ceiling. When Dake saw that the unobtainable beast wanted to touch it, but didn't dare to, he gently patted its head and said, "Unobtainable beast, you will take care of it from now on, okay?" The unobtainable beast was stunned for a moment, then nodded vigorously, its eyes shining. Regardless of whether it was a human or a beast, only after finding the meaning of moving forward could their spirit be raised. The hatching of the unobtainable bird was the biggest surprise of the night for the Magical Zoology Club. All the magic guide fairies gathered and looked at this real baby with eager eyes. The club members hurriedly took out the childcare products that they had bought in advance, scrubbed, and fed the unobtainable bird. There were also people who adjusted the size of the unobtainable bird's sleeping basket and placed a soft and clean quilt inside. The unobtainable bird was actually a very strong species. It didn't need the protection of a female bird to survive in the cruel world of nature. In just a few days, it could grow to have teeth and claws, and its diet included tree bark, grass roots, insects, and most of the foods that were easy to obtain. Within a week, its wings would be fully developed, and it could learn to fly with a gust of wind. Thus, even if the female bird abandoned it after giving birth, it could still maintain a certain degree of survival. However, this still caused the population of the unobtainable bird to continuously decrease. In the end, it was completely dependent on the artificial breeding of mages that prevented it from going extinct. In terms of ecological inheritance, this was actually a species that was seeking death. However, this was a magical animal. It didn't make sense, but it was also a part of magical. Half an hour later, the energetic unobtainable bird fell asleep after eating and drinking to its heart's content. The unobtainable beast guarded the cradle and looked at the chubby little fellow, its heart softening. Dake originally wanted to personally take care of the unobtainable bird, but after seeing this scene, he gave up on the idea. It seemed to be a better idea to let the unobtainable bird be taken care of by the unobtainable beast. He left the room and instructed the most reliable magic guide fairies in the club dormitory, the lion, to take care of the unobtainable bird and the unobtainable beast. Then the horned eagle man suddenly raised its head and puffed out its chest, indicating that it was fine to leave everything to it. How reliable! Dake praised. It seemed that the horned eagle man was also very fond of the unobtainable bird. This made him even more relieved. In the blink of an eye, it's already 10 o'clock. Dake patted Deanna and Luosi, who were still reluctantly looking inside, and reminded them that it was time to go back. Then the group of people dispersed. After returning to the dormitory, Dake began to concentrate on preparing the second spell cage. The clubs in the academy were actually not peaceful because of the strong competition. The student council would rank the clubs according to the strength of the clubs. This was a completely different evaluation system from the semester review. It relied on the overall strength of the clubs. The higher the ranking of the clubs, the more club funds they would receive every month. Moreover, the top 3 societies would be able to obtain additional rare resources. However, new small clubs would generally not participate in the fierce competition. Although the club funds they received every month were very little, it was better than nothing. The clubs with high ranking would generally not lower themselves to challenge the clubs with low ranking. Not only would that make the club lose face, but they would also have to pay a huge price if they accidentally lost. There were not many idiots like that. As for the clubs with low ranking to challenge the clubs with high ranking, they first had to have a spell cage. Of course, Dake Dimming did not take this into consideration when making the spell cage. The first class on Wednesday morning was Magic Language. Professor Halderbode entered the classroom 3 minutes early this time. When he appeared, the classroom was instantly silent. The effect was better than Professor Shierfa's silence. He first put away last week's homework and then said, "From this week onwards, my homework must be completed by Friday night. It will be collected by the second-year leaders of each school and sent to my office by 6 o'clock sharp. For leaders, please stand up." The 4 class leaders who were called stood up under the pressure. It was also at this time that the students had a comprehensive understanding of the second-year leaders. The leader of the House of Nobles was Dolan Teddy. The leader of the House of Knights was Justin Wayne. The leader of the House of Magic was Heidi Euphemia. The leader of the House of Fools was Vanessa Bolt. When the 4 leaders stood up one after another, most of the students' eyes involuntarily focused on the leader of the House of Fools. The students of the House of Fools had never been particularly outstanding. Very few of them could leave a deep impression on others. The same was true for Vanessa Bolt. Her appearance was very ordinary. Her hair color was brown, and the color of her eyes was the same as her hair color. Her facial features were not particularly exquisite, and could only be described as soft and pleasant to look at. Her skin was somewhat sallow, and her figure was neither tall nor short. She was of average height for her age. Her final results last semester were slightly above average. Last week, she passed the dual club's recruitment test without a hitch. The students of the House of Nobles, the House of Knights, and the House of Magic probably did not expect such an ordinary person to become a leader. However, the students of the House of Fools did not seem to be against her. Dake looked at Vanessa with some curiosity. He memorized the leader of the House of Fools, and then looked away. It was not polite to keep staring at people. In short, to be chosen as a leader by the student council, there had to be something extraordinary about her. This Miss Vanessa Bolt might become a formidable opponent of the House of Nobles in another 2 years. After letting the students familiarize themselves with the leaders of their respective houses, Professor Bode continued his lecture. The atmosphere of the Magic Guide class became serious. There were no more unnecessary sounds in the classroom. During the second duel class, Professor Pawa Cheong-si led the second-year students to Duel Hall 1 for physical training. She also checked the results of the students' training over the past week. Students who improved were praised, and those who did not were mostly criticized. Professor Pawa Cheong-si gradually became more strict. Her strictness also made the students more vigilant about the dangers of the dungeon. Many people thought that they would be safe with the dungeon escape device, but that was not the case. Even the professors did not fully understand the mysteries of the dungeon. The deeper they went, the more so it was. The monsters in the upper levels of the dungeon respawned once a week. Even the terrain changed accordingly. But at the middle and lower levels, the respawn rate would gradually decrease, and even lose its rhythm. Moreover, although it was called the middle and lower levels, in fact this so-called middle and lower levels was only the middle and lower levels, in the Academy's knowledge. Because the Shengmalian Academy's dungeon did not have a bottom. People in the past once crowned it with the name Limitless. At the end of the duel class, Professor Pawa Cheong-si released this week's homework. The students who successfully passed the duel club's recruitment test last Friday had to apply for a cultivation battle at the duel club this Friday. That was the newcomer competition on Saturday morning. At the end of the competition, the participating students were required to write a small paper on the analysis of the competition. Students who had already debuted, or students who did not have the qualifications to participate, also had to watch the competition. They had to choose one or more contestants to write an analysis paper with them as the core of the duel situation. This homework, which was released at the beginning of the school year, would continue for 3 weeks with the duel club's 3 weeks of recruitment. If they could not pass the duel club's recruitment test in these 3 weeks, then they could only wait for the beginning of the next semester to compete with the first-year students on the same stage. To any second-year student, this was an unbearable humiliation. But every year, there were people who fell behind. Dake was worried last semester that Luo-si would not pass. Now that he thought about it, he was overthinking it. This Saturday's cultivation battle was very likely to be Luo-si's solo show. After the duel class ended, Dake finished his lunch and went straight to the library. He happened to catch Panduola, who had just come for her shift. With the growth of his knowledge, there were more problems in the process of studying Curse Cage that he did not have before. Dake's first Curse Cage was created under the guidance of Panduola. This time, he encountered a difficult problem, so he naturally went to find Panduola. So without this reason, you wouldn't have come to find me? Panduola rested her chin on her hand and raised her eyebrows. What? Don't I greet you every time I come to the library? Dake looked away and felt a little guilty. That counts. Panduola put down the registration form in her hand, opened the side door of the counter, and welcomed him in. She asked curiously, "Are you preparing for the club challenge?" Dake smiled and said vaguely, "No. It's just that the club familiar that I summoned this time has similar characteristics to the little fiends." Panduola immediately understood and said enviously, "In this year's school championship competition, if our magic faculty wants to win, I'm afraid we have to get past you." Dake shook his head and said modestly, "The main events of the school championship competition are the dungeon tournament and the duel tournament. If we want to increase the score in the duel tournament, we have to complete the year skipping challenge. But the 4th and 5th years of the magic faculty have you and Senior Winnie, so I don't have many choices." Panduola immediately said in surprise. I just mentioned it, and you even thought about it? It seems that your noble house is determined to win this year's school championship competition? Dake. I don't really understand this problem. After staying in the library for an entire afternoon, Dake went to the club classroom. After an entire afternoon of tiredness, he wanted to enter the club classroom to have a good rest, but he didn't expect to be greeted by a clamor as soon as he opened the door. The club classroom was in a state of chaos. The little Osiris that was born less than 24 hours ago was bouncing around like a fat rubber ball. The Yaga beast was chasing it in a hurry, and the floor was covered in bird feathers. The Osiris grew fast, but this one seemed to grow even faster. The other members in the club classroom were all sitting on the sofa and doing their own things as if they were used to this. Their enthusiasm for the wonder of animals seemed to have been exhausted by the course of the afternoon. They carefully closed the door and walked in quietly, but the Osiris suddenly turned its head in the middle of running, and then let out an excited bird cry. It turned around and slid under the Yaga beast's arm, and rolled towards Dake. Dake's mind raced, and in a few seconds, he chose between dodging and attacking. He then bent down and picked up the Osiris. The Osiris immediately stuck to his face and giggled. As he laughed, Dake suddenly realized that the movements in his arms were much quieter. He lowered his head slightly and saw that the Osiris had closed its eyes and was breathing evenly. Obviously, it had fallen asleep. Dake. The Yaga beast walked over with its arms slumped, looking depressed. Dake patted its head, then bent down and put the Osiris in the Yaga beast's hands. The Yaga beast looked happy and carefully held the Osiris, then looked up at Dake again. Dake nodded at him, and the Yaga beast gently carried the Osiris into the room and placed it in the cradle. Then he laid on the edge of the cradle and looked at the Osiris that had fallen asleep. He gently rocked the cradle with a gentle gaze. The afterglow of the sunset shone in through the window, and the room was mottled with light and shadow. Dake stood at the door and looked for a while, then retreated with a gratified expression. He was busy with his studies, and he had a lot of time to think. It was great to have the Yaga beast help take care of the magical animals in the club. Of course, even without the Yaga beast, he believed that the other magic elves would help. Especially Big Milk Can, he would definitely take good care of the Osiris. After sitting down in the president's office, Dake continued to study the curse cage. After the guidance of Panduola Sr., the research on the curse cage was basically in place, and he could try it out tomorrow. But before that, he still had an alchemy class to attend. Professor Kazair's alchemy class was a class that attracted students of all grades in the school. Dake even heard that some of the 6th grade students who were about to apply for internships stopped because of this class. However, Professor Kazair rejected the application of the 6th grade students and only accepted a total of 30 students from the 2nd grade to the 5th grade. He probably felt that the 6th grade students shouldn't delay their plans because of this elective class. It could be seen that he didn't think that his alchemy class was that special. However, the students didn't think so. It was night, and it was raining heavily. Dake Dimeng, who had returned to his dorm to sleep, was suddenly awakened by the sound of thunder. Then there was a slight ripple in his heart, and he opened his eyes halfway through the night. The magic elves that sneaked to his side had already woken up, and they looked at the window with their glowing eyes. Dake quickly got out of bed and walked to the window in a few steps. He opened the door to the balcony and saw a drowned rat clinging to the balcony railing. Hawkman wrestling? Dake opened the railing and picked up the Hawkman wrestling down. The Hawkman wrestling immediately pointed in the direction of the club classroom and cried. Dark raised his head and looked at the brightly lit club classroom. He suddenly frowned, turned around, and went into the room to grab his card bag. Then he put the Hawkman wrestling into the magic card and took out the flight spell. He picked up a jacket and was about to put it on his head. However, the monster suddenly climbed up his body and transformed into a raincoat in the blink of an eye. He immediately activated the flight spell and rushed out from the balcony to the spiral clock tower. The feathered serpent statue at the entrance of the tower opened its snake eyes almost instantly, and the light emitted from the snake eyes lit up the night sky. Dake landed in the corridor on the 10th floor of the spiral clock tower, and rushed into the club classroom without thinking. However, the sound of crying coming from the classroom made him stop. At this time, another bolt of lightning struck. Boom! Dake relaxed and slowly walked to the room of the Ubisoft. On the way, he summoned the Hawkman wrestling again. The Hawkman wrestling subconsciously shook its feathers and found that there was no rainwater on its body. Dark smiled and pushed open the door of the room. The crying sound became louder and louder. The small room was filled with magic elves. The Sabegu beast looked at the crying Ubisoft in the cradle and didn't know what to do until Dake entered the room. It subconsciously turned its head and cried to its master. "What should I do? What should I do?" Dake took a deep breath and squatted down to hug the Sabegu beast. It seemed that until this moment, he remembered that the Sabegu beast he entrusted with the heavy responsibility was just a baby. "I did wrong this time." After comforting the Sabegu beast, Dake got up and looked at the Ubisoft in the cradle. The Ubisoft was awakened by the thunder and rain, and even the Sabegu beast couldn't calm it down. As for the magic elves in the club dormitory, other than the lion beast and the milk can, they were all children. After the lion beasts, Beast King's ghost face, and the milk can's milk feeding attack failed, the magic elves were completely out of ideas. What made them even more nervous was that when the little dream demon wanted to invade the Ubisoft's dream, it was caught by the lion beast and the Ubisoft suddenly began to lose its feathers. Its feathers didn't look like a newborn bird at all. The top of its head to its back was bright black, and the rest was snow white. It was very soft. However, such beautiful feathers were falling one by one. As the Ubisoft cried more and more, the feathers fell faster and faster. The Hawkman wrestling panicked and hurriedly rushed into the rain to seek help from its master. However, when Dake arrived, the Ubisoft's feathers had all fallen. In the cradle, there was a hairless bird crying nonstop. No, it didn't even have the shape of a bird. After the Ubisoft took off its feathers, it became a human. Dake looked at the wailing human baby in the cradle. He didn't try to stop the crying at first. Instead, he lifted the baby's small quilt and looked under it. So it really is a girl? According to the legends, the Ubisoft might be a monogamous reproduction. Dake lifted the quilt and carried the baby girl out of the cradle. Strangely enough, after the baby girl was carried, she gradually stopped crying. There was no need for Dake to think of a way to coax her. She tightly clung to Dake's chest and sobbed until she calmed down. Dake freed one of his hands and the milk can immediately handed him a wet towel. With the wet towel, Dake carefully wiped away the tears and snot on the baby girl's face and rubbed it on her small face. Don't worry, the Ubisoft has the magical ability to take off its feathers and become a human girl. They can weave their feathers into a feather weave. After putting it on, they can return to their original form. Also, the Ubisoft is actually a nocturnal creature. After explaining, Dake carefully observed the Ubisoft's appearance after it turned into a baby girl. It seemed to have inherited the color of its feathers. Its skin was snow white and flawless. Its hair was jet black, and its eyes were also pitch black. But other than that, the baby girl's facial features gave him a very familiar feeling. After a while he muttered, "Her eyebrows are a bit like Lily's. Her ears are a bit pointy. As for her eyes, nose and mouth, why do they look more and more like Joey?" Busy. The polymorph slid down from his body and reformed into the most familiar little Dake. Dake raised his head and chose not to look. But the polymorph suddenly became shorter and shorter. It went from a few years old to a baby of 1 or 2 years old. It was exactly the same as the Ubisoft. The magic elves repeatedly looked at the polymorph and the Ubisoft's faces. When they regained their smiles, there was a hint of envy hidden in their expressions. Although Dake didn't want to admit it, the Ubisoft did look very similar to him after it turned into a human. This resemblance was even greater than the resemblance between John, Joey, and himself. He couldn't help but feel worried. According to the Ubisoft's growth rate, it will only take 2 or 3 years for her to mature. When that time comes, she will turn into a human. The more he thought about it, the more afraid it became. Dake Dimming decided to give up thinking. The moon is bright, the wind is calm, the leaves cover the window lattice. The night heron's cry is like the sound of the zither. The sound of the zither is light, The tune is pleasant, the cradle swings gently. Daddy's baby, close your eyes. He hummed a lullaby and coaxed the baby to sleep. When the Ubisoft's breathing became stable again, Dake carefully put her back in the cradle. The feathers in the cradle suddenly moved on their own and flew back to her body one by one. When the last feather was attached, the Ubisoft had turned back into a bird. Its little wings hugged the edge of the quilt tightly, and it slept soundly. The enchanted fairies that had been guarding it were relieved at the same time. Dake waited in the room for another half an hour. When the thunder completely disappeared and there was only a light drizzle outside, he put on the raincoat made from hundreds of monsters and activated the flying spell to return to the dormitory. Almost at the same time, the feathered serpent statue closed its eyes. The light released from its eyes completely disappeared as its eyelids closed. The night returned to its peaceful state. After the rain, dew dripped down from the castle's eaves. After a long time, it fell to the ground and shattered into fragments of light. When the morning came, the whispers of the students who were doing their morning exercises could be heard inside and outside the castle. Today the Shungmalian Academy was still full of vigor. As for the second-year Magus, he welcomed his first elective class with excitement and anticipation. Dake specially went to the club's classroom to play with the Ubisoft baby, who woke up early, for a while before returning to the castle with his shoulder bag. The alchemy class had begun. 5 and 1 10,000 plus, 187/233. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.